Hey guys. Tonight we drift into the sticky, neon-drenched humidity of 1970s Miami, where the ocean breeze carries equal parts salt, sunscreen, and something far more expensive. You're standing on a cracked sidewalk along Biscayne Boulevard, polyester shirt clinging to your back, disco bass thumping faintly from a club down the block. Palm trees sway like they know a secret. Somewhere nearby, a speedboat engine growls across the dark water. And you're about to step into a chapter of Miami that historians still struggle to describe without raising an eyebrow. You probably wouldn't survive a week here. Honestly, not without SPF 50 and a very good lawyer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're new in town, the year is 1977. And Miami feels like a city that just discovered espresso for the first time, wide awake. Jittery, ambitious. The skyline is modest compared to New York. But cranes are already sketching the future into the sky. Real estate brochures promise paradise. The beaches glow pink at sunset. And beneath that postcard surface, something white and powdery is beginning to move through the city like a quiet tide. Cocaine isn't new, not exactly. It has drifted in and out of American life for decades. In the early 20th century, it was once tucked into patent medicines, even flavoring certain beverages before public health concerns ended that little experiment. But what you're encountering now is different. By the late 1970s, Colombia's trafficking networks have grown startlingly efficient. And South Florida, because of its coastline, its proximity, and its porous borders, has become a primary gateway. You don't know any of that yet. You just know that a man in a white linen suit at the bar keeps laughing too loudly. And everyone seems to have an unusual amount of confidence. The disco lights inside the club flicker across mirrored walls. Think less subtle jazz lounge. More glitter explosion. If modern clubs run on LED panels and curated playlists. This place runs on sweat and impulsive decisions. You push through the door. The air inside is thick, cologne, cigarette smoke, and the faint chemical sweetness you can't quite identify. Donna Summer pours from the speakers. Sequins flash. Someone hands you a drink that tastes like pineapple and bad judgment. It's worth pausing to mention a historical detail. During this period, Miami's population was rapidly diversifying, shaped by waves of immigration from Latin America and the Caribbean. The city was transforming economically and culturally. But alongside legitimate growth, drug money began seeping into construction, nightlife, and even banking. Historians still debate how much of Miami's late 70s boom was directly fueled by cocaine profits versus broader economic trends. The line between the two can feel blurry, like mascara in July heat. You notice how quickly conversations escalate. Deals are hinted at in code. Party favors. Peruvian marching powder. No one says it outright at first. There's an odd etiquette to it. Like discussing the weather. If the weather were illegal and extremely profitable. Then it happens. A small silver tray appears in a back room. The lighting here is softer, more intimate. A bathroom mirror reflects faces leaning in close. The powder is arranged in neat, careful lines, like someone has mistaken the counter for a minimalist art exhibit. You hesitate. In 1977, cocaine still carries a certain glamorous reputation in popular culture. It's whispered about in Hollywood circles, mentioned in magazine profiles of musicians. Unlike heroin, it hasn't yet acquired the same universal stigma. Some even call it the champagne of drugs, which is a strange comparison, because champagne doesn't typically ruin your cardiovascular system. You watch someone lean forward, inhale sharply, then straighten up with an expression of electric clarity. It just sharpens everything, he says, makes you feel like the best version of yourself. You think about that, the best version of yourself, as if you're a software update waiting to download. And because you're human, and curious, and maybe just a little lonely in this bright new city, you lean in too. The powder burns more than you expect. There's a sharp, chemical sting. For a moment, nothing. Then, the world tightens into focus. The music feels precise, every beat distinct. Your thoughts line up neatly, confidently. Words come easily. You feel lighter, almost invincible. If someone asked you to pitch a business idea right now, you'd probably try to sell them bottled Miami humidity. Here's a lesser-known fact. Early users often described cocaine's initial effects as increased sociability and heightened mental clarity. But physicians were already warning about its addictive potential and cardiovascular risks. Emergency rooms in South Florida began seeing more cases of cocaine-related complications by the end of the decade, though the full scale wouldn't become clear until the 1980s. But you're not thinking about statistics. You're thinking about how alive you feel, how the night stretches endlessly ahead. You talk faster, you laugh louder, you promise to call people you've just met. Outside, the ocean keeps rolling in and out, unimpressed. Along the coastline, small planes are already flying low under radar, dropping cargo onto remote strips. Cigarette boats, long, narrow, absurdly fast, skim the water under moonlight. Law enforcement agencies are aware, of course, but coordination is inconsistent. Resources are thin. The scale of what's coming hasn't fully registered. You step back onto the dance floor, heart beating just a little too hard. The city feels synchronized with you, fast, bright, ambitious. You don't yet see the shadow forming at the edges. The insomnia, the paranoia, the way the same powder that sharpens everything will eventually dull it. For now, you just feel unstoppable. And Miami, glowing under its neon halo, seems to agree. The music is still thumping when you notice the first crack in the illusion. Your heart isn't just beating, it's auditioning for a drum solo. You laugh it off. Everyone here seems to vibrate at the same frequency, like the entire club has been plugged into a cosmic outlet. The man in the white linen suit claps you on the back and tells you Miami rewards the bold. You nod, because right now you feel bold enough to negotiate world peace or at least skip the line at the bar. By the late 1970s, cocaine's presence in Miami isn't subtle anymore. Shipments are increasing dramatically, and federal authorities are starting to realize South Florida is becoming the primary entry point for Colombian product into the United States. The geography makes it almost too convenient: short flight paths, sprawling coastline, and a nightlife economy eager to launder both reputations and currency. Historians still debate whether local officials underestimated the scale or simply lacked the tools to stop it. Either way, the powder keeps flowing. You stumble out of the club near dawn. The sky turning sherbet pink over the Atlantic. You haven't slept. You're not tired. In fact, you're explaining to a near stranger why you should both invest in beachfront property immediately. It sounds brilliant in your head. Slightly less so out loud. The first morning after is peculiar. There's a dryness in your throat. A faint drip in your sinuses. Cocaine constricts blood vessels. That's part of how it creates that sharp, focused sensation. It's also why your nose feels like it just went 12 rounds with sandpaper. A lesser-known detail: chronic use can eventually damage nasal tissue, sometimes leading to perforations in the septum. Charming party trick, that. You promise yourself it's just a one-time adventure. A tourist activity, like parasailing, but with worse long-term consequences. Days pass. Miami hums. Construction cranes multiply across the skyline. Luxury condos rise quickly, sometimes financed by investors whose backgrounds are creatively described. Cash purchases become common. Suitcases of currency are not unheard of. In fact, local banks begin seeing unusual surges in deposits. This period would later attract intense scrutiny, culminating in federal investigations into money laundering practices. But for now, it just feels like prosperity. You get invited to another party. This one is in a waterfront mansion, white stucco. Marble floors cool beneath your shoes. A yacht is docked behind the house. Sleek and gleaming. Someone jokes that the boat moves faster than their conscience. You laugh. Because that seems to be the dress code here. Linen, loafers, and selective morality. Inside, the powder is no longer discreetly arranged in bathrooms. It's openly offered in silver bowls. As casual as peanuts at a sports bar. Cocaine has become a status symbol. In certain circles, refusing it feels almost impolite. It's marketed, unofficially, as the drug of ambition. Wall Street is starting to whisper about it too. Energy, focus, edge. You take another line. This time the burn feels familiar. Almost comforting. The rush arrives faster. Your confidence swells again, but there's a sharper edge underneath. You talk over people. You interrupt. Your jaw tightens without you noticing. By 1978 and 1979, Miami's homicide rate is climbing. Some of it tied directly to drug disputes. Firefights in broad daylight become less shocking. The city's police force struggles with resources and coordination, while federal agencies begin ramping up task forces aimed at trafficking networks. The average clubgoer doesn't see the full machinery, but you hear whispers: boats seized, pilots arrested, warehouses raided. And yet the parties continue. That's the strange part. It's as if two Miamis exist at once. One of sunlit beaches and disco glamour. The other of backroom negotiations and silent threats. You start staying up later. Sleep feels optional, almost inefficient. Cocaine suppresses appetite, too, so you forget to eat. Coffee becomes redundant. You're already wired. But when the high dips, it dips fast. There's a hollow feeling. Like someone quietly unplugged you. Irritability creeps in. Here's something rarely discussed in those glossy magazine profiles from the era. The crash can bring anxiety, restlessness, even mild depression. The brain, having been flooded with dopamine, recalibrates uncomfortably. You don't frame it that way, of course. You just think you need a little more to smooth things out. That's how it begins. not with desperation, but with adjustment. You tell yourself you're still in control. You have a job. You show up. Mostly, you're just a little sharper, a little faster than everyone else. You start to notice who in your circle uses regularly. There's a silent recognition, like members of a secret club. Quick bathroom trips, subtle nods. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies are quietly coordinating efforts that will later be known as major anti-money laundering operations. The groundwork is being laid. Undercover agents blend into the same nightlife you frequent. Sometimes you wonder, half-jokingly, if the overly friendly guy at the bar is too friendly. Then you dismiss the thought. Paranoia is for people who overthink. Except you do start overthinking. At night, when the rush fades, your thoughts race in less pleasant directions. Did you say too much at that party? Who exactly owns that yacht? Why did that man mention airstrips so casually? You look at yourself in the mirror one evening. Your eyes are bright, but there's a tension around them. A tightness. Miami's neon glow reflects off the glass. And for a moment you don't recognize the person staring back. Still, when the invitation arrives for another weekend on the water, music, champagne, the good stuff, you don't hesitate long. The memory of that first electric rush outweighs the growing unease. The ocean is calm as the yacht pulls away from the dock. The skyline recedes, glittering and indifferent. Somewhere beyond the horizon, more shipments are already en route. Planes flying low, boats cutting through moonlit waves. A supply chain built on risk and staggering profit. And you, leaning against the railing, tell yourself this is just living. Just youth. Just Miami. Your heart beats a little faster than it should. But the music is loud. The laughter louder. And the powder, well, the powder promises that everything is still under control. The yacht rocks gently beneath your feet. And for a moment the ocean feels like the only stable thing in your life. The bass from portable speakers vibrates through the deck, mingling with the steady churn of engines. Someone pops champagne. Someone else disappears below deck with a silver tray. The skyline of Miami glitters in the distance like it's applauding your questionable life choices. You lean over the railing, breathing in salt air, telling yourself this is sophistication. This is success adjacent. This is what happens when a city decides to sprint instead of walk. By 1979, the nickname, Cocaine Cowboys, is beginning to circulate, first quietly, then more openly, referring to the traffickers who operate with swagger and startling boldness. South Florida has become a primary corridor for Colombian cartels, particularly networks connected to Medellin. Smugglers use small aircraft flying under radar coverage, dropping packages into the Everglades or landing on improvised airstrips. High-speed, cigarette boats, long and narrow with powerful engines, skim across the water at night, outrunning slower patrol vessels. You hear stories at the party. A pilot who made more in a week than a surgeon earns in a year. A boat captain who installed extra fuel tanks to outrun federal agents. A warehouse in Hialeah filled with shrink-wrapped bricks stacked like minimalist architecture. Historians still debate whether the audacity of these operations stemmed from overconfidence or from the simple math of profit margins so enormous they dwarfed the risks. When a single shipment could generate millions, caution sometimes took a backseat to bravado. Someone beside you gestures toward the dark horizon and says, "It's all out there." You're not sure if he means the future or the next delivery. You take another line below deck. The rush is faster now. Almost impatient. Your heart tightens, then surges. Conversation feels urgent, competitive. You find yourself speaking in absolutes. Everything is either brilliant or terrible. There's no middle ground anymore. Back on land, Miami is shifting. Homicide rates are climbing sharply as rival trafficking groups clash. Law enforcement agencies are overwhelmed by the scale and frequency of violence. Shootings that once would have stunned the city are becoming grimly familiar. Yet the nightclubs remain packed. Real estate keeps rising. It's as if prosperity and chaos are dancing together under a disco ball. You notice something new at this party. Men with heavier watches and lighter smiles. Their laughter doesn't quite reach their eyes. Conversations lower when certain names are mentioned. Deals are made with handshakes that look friendly but feel transactional. There's a strange glamour to it all. Expensive cars line the marina, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, symbols of sudden wealth. But beneath the chrome and leather, tension hums. You sense it even through the chemical brightness flooding your brain. A lesser-known fact from this era, some traffickers reportedly tested new recruits by observing how they handled stress, whether they panicked under pressure or kept their composure during risky runs. Reliability mattered more than charm. And you, jittery and wide-eyed, would not pass that test. You can barely pass for calm while holding a cocktail. Later that week, you're in a nightclub bathroom again. The mirror is smudged. The fluorescent light flickers. You lean closer and notice the faint redness around your nostrils. Your jaw aches from clenching. Cocaine's vasoconstrictive properties are doing their quiet work, narrowing blood vessels, pushing your cardiovascular system harder than it was designed to go. Emergency physicians in Miami are beginning to see more cases of arrhythmias and chest pain in otherwise young, healthy people, but that information hasn't filtered down to you in a meaningful way. Instead, you focus on the high, on the feeling that you belong to something larger than yourself, a city in fast forward. Then comes the shift. One afternoon, you're driving along US 1 when a news bulletin interrupts the radio music. Another shooting. Broad daylight. Suspected drug ties. The announcer's voice is calm, almost weary. You feel a flicker of unease. It's one thing to hear rumors at parties. It's another to hear the violence described between traffic updates and weather forecasts. The Dade County morgue is reportedly struggling to keep up with the influx of homicide victims as the drug wars intensify. That's not a headline splashed across glossy magazines. But it's a reality forming quietly in the background. You tell yourself you're not involved in any of that. You're just adjacent. A spectator, a recreational participant in a recreational scene. But adjacency has a way of shrinking. At another gathering, someone mentions a warehouse raid. Another mentions a pilot who won't be flying anymore. The laughter is thinner tonight. You notice how often people glance over their shoulders. Paranoia, once theoretical, is becoming ambient. Cocaine amplifies it. That's the tricky part. The same substance that makes you feel invincible can also heighten suspicion. Small sounds feel significant. A car idling too long outside makes your pulse spike. A stranger's stare lingers a second too long. You lie awake at 3 a.m. Heart still racing hours after the last line. The ceiling fan spins lazily above you. Miami's humid air presses against the windows. You replay conversations in your head. analyzing tone and phrasing as if you're studying for an exam in self-preservation. And yet, when the weekend arrives, you go out again. Because the alternative, staying home, sitting with the quiet, confronting the jittery emptiness that follows the crash, feels worse. Because the city is alive, and you want to be alive with it. On the surface, Miami in 1979 is thriving. Tourism, construction, nightlife. Beneath it, a parallel economy pulses with extraordinary speed. Billions of dollars will eventually be traced back to these years, reshaping financial regulations and federal enforcement strategies. But tonight, all you see are lights reflecting off water. You lean against the bar, pulse elevated, eyes bright. The bartender knows your order now. The man in the linen suit nods from across the room. The music swells. You tell yourself you're just riding the wave. You don't notice how far from shore you've drifted. The wave you're riding doesn't crash all at once. It shimmers. It sparkles. It hands you another drink and tells you to relax. You're back under the mirrored lights of a disco that looks suspiciously inspired by New York's Studio 54, though this is Miami. So the shirts are more unbuttoned and the tans more aggressive. The dance floor pulses like a living thing. Sequins scatter light across the ceiling. Someone is wearing sunglasses indoors at midnight. Which feels less ridiculous when everyone's pupils are the size of dinner plates. Cocaine has shifted from novelty to accessory. It's not whispered about as much now. It's implied, expected. The champagne of drugs label floats around casually, as if branding alone could soften chemistry. In certain circles, declining a line earns you the same look you'd get for refusing cake at a birthday party. Suspicious, mildly offensive. You take one. Of course you do. The burn feels routine now. Like the city's humidity, annoying but familiar. The rush follows quickly, smoothing out the fatigue you've been pretending not to notice. Because here's the thing. You're not sleeping well anymore. Cocaine's half-life is relatively short, but its effects on your nervous system linger. You fall asleep late, wake up early, heart already tapping out an anxious rhythm. Miami itself isn't sleeping much either. By the late 1970s, trafficking networks are scaling up dramatically. Federal agencies are increasing surveillance efforts. But coordination across local, state, and federal lines remains inconsistent. Smugglers exploit gaps in radar coverage and jurisdictional confusion. Historians still debate whether earlier, more unified intervention could have curbed the explosion, or whether the economic incentives were simply too powerful. On the dance floor, none of that seems to matter. You feel articulate, magnetic. You promise someone you'll invest in their nightclub concept. You tell another person you're thinking about getting into logistics. That's what they call it now. Logistics. As if it's just about shipping furniture instead of powdered contraband. There's a strange optimism in the air. Miami is booming. Luxury condos are rising. Foreign investment pours in. Some legitimate, some less so. A lesser-known detail from this era, certain South Florida banks experienced dramatic increases in cash deposits, sometimes accepting large sums with minimal questioning. The regulatory environment wasn't yet fully adapted to the tidal wave of illicit currency. Operation Greenback, one of the first major federal initiatives targeting money laundering in Miami, would soon begin to tighten scrutiny. But tonight, the money flows as freely as the rum. You excuse yourself to the bathroom again. The mirror feels less friendly these days. There's a faint tremor in your hands when the rush peaks. Your jaw aches from clenching. Your appetite has shrunk noticeably. Cocaine suppresses hunger by stimulating the central nervous system, which sounds efficient until you realize your body still requires actual nutrients. Who knew? You splash water on your face. Your reflection stares back, eyes bright, skin slightly drawn. You look energized and exhausted at the same time. It's an odd combination, like a smartphone stuck at 12% battery but refusing to shut down. Back in the main room, someone is talking loudly about a new speedboat. Faster engines, reinforced hull. He brags that it can outrun anything short of a Coast Guard helicopter. There's laughter, but it's edged. The kind of laughter that understands risk but pretends not to. You've started noticing the edges more. The way conversations abruptly shift when unfamiliar faces approach. The way certain names are spoken carefully. Violence is no longer an abstract headline, it's part of the atmosphere. Shootings tied to drug disputes are increasing across Dade County. What once shocked now merely interrupts dinner. And yet the glamour persists. A local fashion photographer snaps pictures at the party. Glossy magazines begin featuring Miami nightlife as if it's the future of American cool. Bright suits, bold music, endless energy. They rarely mention the morgue backlog. Historians still argue about the psychological transformation of the city during these years, how quickly normalization set in. When extraordinary violence becomes ordinary background noise, what does that do to a community's collective nerves? You feel it in your own nerves. The high tonight is slightly different. Sharper, less euphoric, more driven. You talk faster. Interrupt more. When someone challenges your opinion about real estate prices, you snap back with unexpected intensity. Later, you barely remember the argument. Cocaine's effect on impulse control can be subtle at first, then unmistakable. Around 3 a.m., the crash creeps in. It's not dramatic, just a quiet deflation. The music feels louder than it should. The lights harsher. Your thoughts, once streamlined, begin to scatter. You feel irritable, slightly hollow. Someone suggests, a little more. The phrase sounds harmless, responsible, even, just smoothing out the edges. You hesitate for half a second. Then you follow them back to the mirrored bathroom. The cycle tightens. High. Confidence, irritability, crash, repeat. Driving home at dawn, the sky pale over the Atlantic. You notice your hands gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. A police cruiser passes in the opposite lane. And your pulse spikes irrationally. You're not carrying anything. You're not dealing. You're just participating. But the paranoia lingers. Cocaine amplifies vigilance. It whispers that everything is significant. You park outside your apartment. The city is quiet for once. Seagulls wheel overhead. Somewhere in the distance, construction equipment clanks to life. Miami keeps building. Upward, outward, faster. Inside, you lie on your bed fully clothed. Sleep refuses to arrive. Your heart still beats a little too fast. You stare at the ceiling fan spinning lazily, thinking about the yacht, the speedboats, the silver trays. You tell yourself this is just a phase, a glamorous chapter. But chapters have a way of turning pages without asking. The pages turn whether you're ready or not. And tonight they turn toward the water. You're standing at a marina just after midnight. The air thick and metallic with salt. The docks creak softly beneath your shoes. Cigarette boats line the slips, long, narrow, painted in aggressive colors that look fast even when they're still. Their engines, when they start, don't purr, they roar. Someone hands you a beer you don't really want. You haven't been hungry all day. You haven't slept much either. But you're alert, too alert, your thoughts humming like high-tension wires. The man beside you gestures proudly at one of the boats. Extra fuel tanks. Reinforced fiberglass hull. Twin high-performance engines capable of slicing through open water at speeds that make common sense file a formal complaint. During the late 1970s, these vessels became a preferred method for smugglers moving cocaine from larger, motherships, offshore to hidden inlets along Florida's coast. Their speed often outmatched standard patrol craft. It was a nautical arms race. And Miami was the starting line. Historians still debate whether the rapid escalation in maritime smuggling caught authorities off guard or whether bureaucratic limitations simply slowed the response. Radar coverage was patchy in certain areas. Jurisdictional boundaries complicated pursuit. Meanwhile, the boats kept coming. You're invited aboard. Not as crew. Not as anything official. Just as a spectator. A guest. Adjacent again. That word you use to make yourself feel safer than you are. The engine ignites. And the entire dock vibrates. You feel it in your ribs. The boat pulls away, cutting across Biscayne Bay under a thin wash of moonlight. The skyline shrinks behind you, neon smearing into a watercolor blur. Out on open water, the wind slaps against your face. It feels cleansing at first. Honest, the speed is intoxicating in its own right, like strapping yourself to a lightning bolt. You laugh louder than necessary. The others do too. Then someone produces a small wrapped package. Not large, dense, treated with casual reverence. You don't touch it, you just look at it. It's strange how something so small can carry such enormous consequence. A kilo of cocaine at this time can fetch staggering profits once distributed. Multiply that by dozens, hundreds of shipments, and you begin to understand how entire networks are financed. A lesser-known detail: traffickers sometimes used coded radio chatter and staggered boat departures to reduce detection risk. Coordinating pickups in shallow waters where larger enforcement vessels struggled to maneuver. Improvisation was constant. So was danger. You tell yourself you're just here for the thrill of the ride. But your heart is pounding harder than the engines now. And not entirely from excitement. Cocaine and adrenaline are poor roommates. They both insist on occupying the same space in your nervous system. The boat slows near a dark shape on the horizon, a larger vessel idling with minimal lights. There's a brief exchange. Efficient. Quiet. You watch shadows move packages with mechanical precision. No shouting. No drama. Just business. It's disturbingly ordinary. On shore, Miami continues its daytime performance. Tourists sunbathing. Developers signing contracts. Banks processing deposits. But here, under the moon, you glimpse the machinery beneath the glamour. The supply chain. The risk calculation. Historians still argue about how deeply the cocaine trade infiltrated legitimate industries during this era: construction, hospitality, finance. The lines blur in hindsight. Cash-rich investors appeared almost overnight. Luxury properties were bought outright. Some institutions tightened compliance. Others looked the other way until federal pressure mounted. The transfer complete. Your boat rockets back toward shore. The city lights swell again, welcoming and indifferent. Later, at a waterfront house, the mood shifts from focused efficiency back to party bravado. Music returns. Drinks clink. The packages vanish into another room. You're offered a line as casually as someone offering gum. You take it. The rush is sharp, almost aggressive. For a moment, you feel invincible again, like you've glimpsed the hidden engine of Miami and somehow earned a backstage pass. But there's a cost building quietly. Your chest feels tight more often now. Not painful, just aware. Cocaine increases heart rate and blood pressure, constricting coronary arteries. In rare cases, even among young users, it can trigger heart attacks or strokes. Emergency physicians in South Florida are becoming increasingly familiar with these patterns. You, however, are more familiar with dance floors than discharge summaries. Around you, laughter echoes off marble walls. Someone brags about a recent run that paid for a new sports car. Someone else mentions a close call with a patrol unit, describing it like a near miss in a video game. The tone is half joke, half warning. You notice how often the word risk is replaced with opportunity. As the night stretches, paranoia flickers at the edges again. A car idles outside longer than seems necessary. A phone call is taken in another room. Voice lowered. Cocaine sharpens your senses, but it also distorts them. Every shadow looks meaningful. Every delay feels suspicious. You step onto the balcony for air. The humid breeze presses against your skin. Below, the dark water laps quietly against the dock, as if none of this concerns it. You remember when Miami felt purely electric. Now it feels electric and unstable, like exposed wiring behind a glossy wall. The party continues inside, but you linger outside longer than usual. Your thoughts race, not with grand plans this time, but with questions. How many boats are out there tonight? How many deals? How many chances for something to go wrong? You tell yourself you're still just a spectator. But spectators don't usually ride along. And as the engines in the marina rumble to life again somewhere in the distance, you realize the water isn't just scenery anymore. It's a highway, and you're closer to the traffic than you ever intended to be. The traffic doesn't stay offshore. It pulls into parking lots. It walks through sliding glass doors. It stands under fluorescent lights pretending to shop for socks. You're at Dadeland Mall on a warm July afternoon in 1979. The air conditioning humming like a mechanical lullaby. Families wander between department stores. Teenagers loiter near the arcade. The scent of pretzels and perfume hangs politely in the air. It feels safe, commercial, suburban. You're here to meet someone for coffee. You tell yourself you need a normal afternoon. Something daylight. Something that doesn't involve docks or mirrored bathroom counters. Your hands are steady today. Mostly. You didn't sleep much, but that's becoming your baseline. Then the sound cracks through the mall. At first, it doesn't register. A sharp pop, maybe construction, a dropped display rack, but then another, and another. The sound ricochets off tile and glass. People freeze. Then they run. The Dadeland Mall shooting, what will later be known as the Dadeland Massacre, erupts in broad daylight as rival drug traffickers open fire inside the shopping center. 2 men are killed in a hail of automatic gunfire. Shoppers dive for cover. Storefront windows shatter. It's loud, chaotic, terrifying. You drop instinctively behind a kiosk selling sunglasses that suddenly feel deeply unnecessary. Your heart slams against your ribs. And for once it's not chemical. It's pure, primal fear. The shooters flee. Sirens converge. The mall transforms from consumer paradise to crime scene in minutes. This moment becomes a turning point in Miami's public perception. Violence linked to cocaine trafficking is no longer confined to shadowy docks or industrial warehouses. It's in a mall, in daylight, in front of families. Historians still debate whether this event marked the psychological tipping point for the city, when denial became impossible. Miami had seen rising homicide rates already. But the brazenness of gunfire in a crowded shopping center shattered the illusion that the drug war operated at a safe distance from everyday life. You sit on the curb outside as police tape flutters in the humid breeze. Your ears ring faintly. Reporters gather quickly, microphones appearing like metal flowers. You watch paramedics move with grim efficiency. And for the first time, the glamour evaporates. You think about the yacht, the speedboats, the silver trays, the laughter that always seemed a little too loud. This is the other side of that world. The part no one includes in glossy nightlife spreads. A lesser-known detail, the sheer volume of gunfire used in the Dadeland shooting shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers, highlighting how heavily armed certain traffickers had become. Semi-automatic weapons were increasingly common in these disputes, escalating both lethality and public fear. You drive home slowly, radio buzzing with breaking news updates. Commentators speculate about cartel involvement, about escalating turf wars. The phrase, drug violence, is repeated so often it begins to lose shape. At home, you close the blinds. Though it's still daylight, your pulse refuses to settle. Cocaine lingers in your system from the night before, amplifying every anxious thought. The drug heightens the fight or flight response. And today your nervous system is fully committed to flight. You pace your apartment. The refrigerator hum sounds suspiciously loud. A car door slams outside. And your shoulders jerk. You tell yourself you weren't involved. You were just shopping, just living, but you can't ignore the proximity anymore. The same networks that fueled your weekend thrills just turned a mall into a battlefield. Later that evening, friends call. Their voices are tight but performatively casual. Crazy, right? One says, bad for business. Another jokes that Miami's becoming the Wild West with better beaches. You laugh weakly, because humor is easier than admitting fear. The news reports mention connections to cocaine trafficking disputes. They talk about rival groups vying for territory, about millions of dollars at stake. You think about how small a kilo looked on that boat, how abstract the risk felt. It doesn't feel abstract now. Emergency rooms across Dade County are already strained from rising violence. The morgue, too. By the end of 1979, Miami's homicide rate will be among the highest in the nation. And yet, even as officials promise crackdowns, the demand for cocaine across the United States continues to climb. Supply meets demand. Boats meet shoreline. Historians still argue about whether public shock translated into meaningful policy shifts at that exact moment, or whether broader federal initiatives were already in motion. What's clear is that fear spreads faster than legislation. That night, you don't go out. For once, you sit in dim light. listening to the ceiling fan slice the air. Your body feels jittery without the distraction of music. The crash from your last high settles in like a heavy blanket, irritability. Low mood, annoying restlessness. You consider calling someone. You consider not. The city outside doesn't pause. Traffic moves. Neon signs flicker on. Somewhere, another party starts. Somewhere else, another deal is negotiated. You close your eyes and see flashes of the mall, people running. Glass shattering. The sudden realization that paradise has a fracture line. You tell yourself you can step back. That you can keep your distance from the deeper currents. But the powder has already rewired your evenings. The rush has already reshaped your expectations of what normal feels like. And as sirens echo faintly across the humid night, you understand something new. Miami isn't just dancing anymore. It's unraveling in rhythm. The unraveling doesn't look dramatic at first. It looks like an envelope of cash on your kitchen counter. You're staring at it in the soft morning light filtering through half-closed blinds. The ceiling fan hums above you, your constant companion now. White noise for a brain that rarely powers down. The envelope isn't thick enough to be cinematic. No rubber-banded stacks. Just a few $1,000s. Enough to make your rent feel hypothetical. It came from helping out. A friend needed someone reliable to hold onto something for a night. A package. Sealed. Anonymous. You didn't open it. You didn't ask questions. You told yourself you were just storing a box. Not participating in a supply chain that stretches from Andean mountains to mirrored bathroom counters in Miami Beach. Adjacency again. Your favorite illusion. The cash is crisp. It smells faintly metallic, like fresh ink and risk. You run your thumb along the edges. Easy money has a particular glow to it. It feels earned even when it isn't. By the late 1970s, small-time participants like you are becoming common, people who aren't cartel leaders or speedboat captains, but facilitators, drivers, couriers, temporary storage. The cocaine trade isn't just a handful of dramatic figures, it's a layered ecosystem. Historians still debate how many ordinary residents drifted into peripheral roles out of ambition, desperation, or simple proximity. The lines between involved and not involved blur quickly. You justify it easily. You're not carrying weapons. You're not negotiating shipments. You're just helping. And besides, the money smooths things out. You've been using more frequently now. Not every day, yet, but often enough that your baseline mood depends on it. The crash feels heavier when it comes. Irritability snaps at small inconveniences. A slow cashier feels like a personal insult. Traffic lights become existential threats. A lesser-known detail about cocaine's psychology: repeated use can subtly recalibrate your reward system. Activities that once felt satisfying, food, conversation, a quiet walk by the ocean, start to feel muted by comparison. Your brain, flooded artificially with dopamine, becomes less impressed by ordinary pleasures. You don't notice the shift happening. You just notice that everything feels a little dull unless you're on. That envelope of cash makes dullness easier to ignore. You decide to celebrate. Because of course you do. Celebration is the city's default setting. The club tonight is louder than usual. News of the Dadeland shooting still lingers in conversations. But it's spoken about in the past tense now. As if it were weather. Crazy week. Someone says, already halfway through a laugh. Miami has a short memory when there's music involved. You spot the man in the linen suit again. He looks thinner, or maybe sharper. It's hard to tell. Cocaine has a way of carving faces into angles. He congratulates you on being useful. The word lands differently than you expected. In a back room, the lines are laid out with mechanical precision. You take one without hesitation. The burn is immediate, familiar. The rush follows like a practiced routine. Confidence, clarity, energy. You talk about investment opportunities, nightclubs, import businesses, real estate flips. In 1978 and 1979, Miami's property market is swelling rapidly, fueled in part by foreign capital and, investigators will later argue, significant inflows of drug money. Operation Greenback, launched around this time, begins targeting money laundering in South Florida banks, recognizing that cash isn't just sitting under mattresses, it's entering financial institutions. Historians still debate how transformative these early federal efforts were in slowing illicit flows versus simply redirecting them. Financial crime adapts quickly, so does ambition. You're not thinking about policy, though. You're thinking about leverage, about how a few $1,000s could turn into 10. The high amplifies your optimism to unreasonable levels. You make promises you can't quantify. You sketch plans on cocktail napkins like a caffeinated architect of nonsense. Later, alone in the bathroom, you catch your reflection again. Your pupils are wide. There's a faint twitch in your cheek you hadn't noticed before. Your nose feels perpetually irritated now. You tell yourself it's allergies. Miami has plenty of pollen. That's the story you prefer. Back on the dance floor, someone whispers about a new distribution route. Another mentions a warehouse near the airport. You listen more closely than you used to. Not because you plan to act, at least that's what you claim, but because proximity has become intoxicating in its own right. There's a myth circulating in your circle, that cocaine dealing is effortless wealth. Quick runs, quick cash, early retirement. What rarely gets mentioned are the arrests quietly increasing, the undercover operations expanding, the federal agents blending into the same nightlife. You feel the first flicker of genuine temptation tonight. Not just to hold something temporarily, but to participate more actively. The math seems simple in your chemically enhanced brain. Demand is high, supply is constant, margins are enormous. But then you remember them all. The gunfire, the way fear felt without chemical distortion. You step outside for air again. The humid night presses against you. Sirens wail faintly in the distance. Not unusual anymore. The city's soundtrack includes them now. You think about how easily you justified that envelope of cash. How quickly it became normal. Cocaine whispers efficiency into your thoughts. It tells you you're sharper than others. More capable. Less vulnerable. It convinces you that you can navigate this ecosystem without being consumed by it. Historians still debate whether individuals like you, small players on the periphery, underestimated the structural forces at work. The scale of the trade wasn't built on isolated choices. It was built on thousands of small rationalizations. You look down at your hands. They're steady right now, energized. Inside, the music surges again. Laughter spills out onto the sidewalk. The party is still alive. The money is still tempting. The powder is still available. You tell yourself you'll keep it small. Just enough to stay afloat. Just enough to feel ahead. But the envelope on your kitchen counter has already changed something. You're no longer just adjacent. You stop calling it an envelope. Now it's float, working capital, opportunity. The language evolves faster than your conscience. You're sitting in a modest downtown bank branch on a weekday afternoon. Fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The air smells like carpet cleaner and ambition. You're wearing your best attempt at respectable, pressed shirt. Watch polished. Jaw unclenched on purpose. The envelope, the float, rests inside a plain leather folder on your lap. You're not depositing a fortune. Not enough to trigger cinematic suspicion. Just enough to test the waters. In the late 1970s, Miami's banks began experiencing dramatic increases in cash deposits. South Florida, positioned as a gateway to Latin America, already had a culture of international banking. But the sheer volume of currency moving through certain institutions began raising eyebrows. Operation Greenback, initiated around 1978, targeted money laundering schemes tied to narcotics trafficking. Federal investigators started scrutinizing suspiciously structured deposits, amounts broken into smaller sums to avoid reporting thresholds. Historians still debate whether early enforcement actions were proactive or reactive, whether regulators truly grasped the scale of laundering before it ballooned beyond easy containment. Financial oversight frameworks were evolving, but the cocaine economy was evolving faster. You approach the teller with what you hope is casual confidence. Your pulse ticks slightly higher than necessary. Cocaine from the night before still lingers in your system, sharpening your senses into overdrive. The hum of printers sounds louder than it should. The tapping of keyboards feels accusatory. Just making a deposit, you say, smiling a little too brightly. The teller counts the bills with mechanical indifference. Cash is cash, at least for now. A lesser-known fact from this era, some banks in Miami were later fined heavily for inadequate reporting of large cash transactions. Not always because of direct complicity, but because compliance systems lagged behind the tidal wave of narcotics money. It wasn't always cinematic corruption. Sometimes it was bureaucracy overwhelmed by volume. You walk out of the branch feeling oddly triumphant. You half-expected alarms, spotlights, a stern man in a grey suit asking pointed questions. Instead, you got a stamped receipt. The ease unsettles you more than resistance would have. That night, you're back in a condo overlooking the water. Floor-to-ceiling windows frame the skyline like a postcard from a future that feels dangerously attainable. The host brags about closing on the property in cash. Foreign investors. He says with a wink that's either playful or revealing. It's hard to tell anymore. Cocaine sits openly on the glass coffee table, beside crystal tumblers and glossy real estate brochures. The juxtaposition would be absurd if it weren't so normalized. You take a line. The rush is familiar, but there's something else now, an undercurrent of calculation. You start thinking about scalability, about margins, about how many small deposits it would take to turn your modest float into something meaningful. Cocaine doesn't just energize you. It inflates your sense of competence. You feel sharper than bankers, smarter than regulators, faster than consequences. It's a dangerous cocktail, stimulant plus ego. Around you, conversations drift toward expansion, new routes, new contacts, airstrips deeper in the Everglades. Cigarette boats modified with even more powerful engines. Someone mentions radar detection equipment. Someone else laughs and says technology can't keep up with creativity. Historians still argue about the technological cat and mouse game between traffickers and law enforcement during this period. Smugglers adapted quickly, flying lower, landing shorter, communicating in coded bursts. Enforcement agencies increased surveillance, formed joint task forces, and slowly began closing gaps. But for a time, the traffickers seemed perpetually one step ahead. You step onto the balcony for air. Again, it's becoming a ritual. The humid breeze presses against your skin. The water below reflects city lights in fractured streaks. Your chest tightens briefly, not pain, just pressure. You rub it absent-mindedly. Cocaine constricts coronary arteries, increases blood pressure, accelerates heart rate. The cardiovascular strain builds quietly over time. Emergency physicians in Miami are seeing younger patients with symptoms once reserved for older demographics. You tell yourself you're too young for statistics. Inside, laughter erupts. Someone is recounting a close call with federal agents, describing it like an action movie scene. Everyone laughs at the narrow escape. No one mentions the possibility of prison in a serious tone. You return to the glass table. The powder looks almost decorative now, like fine sugar sprinkled on a dessert that happens to erode your self-control. You take another line. The burn is sharper tonight. Or maybe your nerves are thinner. The high surges. Confidence blooms. Doubt recedes. You begin outlining a plan to formalize your involvement, small distribution. Nothing flashy. Controlled growth. You even use the phrase risk management, which would be hilarious if it weren't slightly terrifying. A friend leans in and says, "You've got the head for this." The compliment lands deep. Cocaine amplifies it into prophecy. But beneath the glow, something flickers. You remember them all. The sirens. The way fear felt without chemical distortion. You remember how easy that bank deposit was, and how that ease might not last. Operation Greenback is expanding quietly. Undercover agents are embedding themselves deeper into financial investigations. Suspicious activity reports are becoming more routine. The system is learning, slowly. Historians still debate how much damage was already baked in by the time serious financial enforcement gained traction. Once billions circulate, disentangling them is like trying to unmix cream from coffee. You glance at your reflection in the dark window. The skyline overlays your face, neon intersecting your features. You look ambitious, wired, slightly hollow around the eyes. You tell yourself you're building something. But as the night deepens and your heart keeps racing long after the music softens, you can't ignore the quiet truth pressing at the edges. You're not building. You're balancing, on a wire stretched between easy money and inevitable gravity. Balancing on a wire feels thrilling at first, until you realize there's no net. And the wind is picking up. You're awake again at 3:17 a.m. The digital clock glows red in the dark, accusatory and precise. You haven't taken anything tonight. That was the plan. Reset. You told yourself. Prove you're fine. Your body disagrees. Your thoughts race without direction. Like a car engine revving in neutral. The ceiling fan spins lazily, slicing the humid air into soft, repetitive whispers. Each rotation sounds louder than it should. You shift in bed. Your heart beats just slightly too fast for someone lying perfectly still. This is the part no one advertises at the yacht parties. Cocaine's come down isn't dramatic in a cinematic sense. It's subtler: irritability, restlessness, a hollow feeling in your chest that isn't quite sadness, but isn't comfort either. Your brain, accustomed to artificially elevated dopamine, recalibrates downward. Normal pleasure feels muted. A lesser-known medical reality: repeated cocaine use can alter stress hormone levels, increasing anxiety even during periods of abstinence. The nervous system remains on edge, as if it's waiting for a threat that never quite arrives. You lie there feeling like a smoke alarm with no visible fire. Outside, Miami is quieter at this hour, but not silent. A distant siren wails, then fades. Somewhere, a car door slams. In another apartment, a television murmurs through thin walls. You wonder who else is awake. By the late 1970s, Miami's homicide rate has surged dramatically, driven in large part by cocaine-related violence. Law enforcement resources are stretched thin. Patrol cars are more visible in certain neighborhoods. Helicopters occasionally sweep overhead at night. The city's pulse feels irregular. Historians still debate whether the psychological impact of this era, this normalization of violence and hyper-alertness, reshaped Miami's identity long after the peak of the cocaine boom. Did the city become more guarded, more hardened, or was it simply adapting to extraordinary circumstances? You feel yourself adapting. You start checking the locks twice before bed. You glance over your shoulder in parking lots. When a car follows you for more than 2 turns, your pulse spikes. Rationally, you know it's likely coincidence. Chemically, it feels like surveillance. Paranoia is one of cocaine's quieter companions. It doesn't always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it's just a subtle tightening in your chest when someone laughs behind you. Sometimes it's replaying conversations, searching for hidden meaning. You remember a joke you made at the condo party about expanding distribution. Did someone take that seriously? Did you say too much? You roll onto your side. Sleep refuses to cooperate. In the daylight, you function, mostly. You show up to work. You smile. You deposit another modest sum at the bank, careful to keep it below thresholds you've heard whispered about. Structured deposits are becoming more common, a tactic to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. Federal investigators are learning to recognize patterns. Operation Greenback is no longer theoretical, it's active. But at night, your thoughts grow teeth. You run into the linen suit man at a cafe one afternoon. He looks tired beneath his sunglasses. Thinner. He jokes about needing a vacation somewhere without extradition treaties. You laugh, because that's what you do. But the joke lingers. A rumor circulates that someone you met on the yacht has been arrested. Another rumor says someone else disappeared, went back home. People say vaguely. No one clarifies which home. Historians still argue about the scale of federal infiltration during these years. How many informants were quietly embedded within trafficking networks? How many deals unraveled because someone decided prison was less frightening than their partners? Trust erodes quickly in high-risk ecosystems. You notice it in small ways. Conversations lower when you approach. Not because they suspect you, but because everyone suspects everyone. You go out again despite the insomnia. Because the alternative is lying awake with your own thoughts. The club feels louder than before. The lights harsher. You take a line, telling yourself it will smooth the edges. For a brief moment, it does. The rush washes away the low-grade anxiety like a chemical eraser. You feel articulate again, in control. But the paranoia doesn't disappear entirely anymore. It coexists with the high. When someone brushes past you too quickly, your heart leaps. When a stranger lingers near your table, you wonder who sent him. A lesser-known psychological effect of chronic stimulant use. The boundary between rational caution and exaggerated suspicion begins to blur. You can't always tell which thoughts are reasonable and which are chemically amplified. You catch your reflection in the bathroom mirror, again that mirror. It's becoming a character in your life. Your eyes look brighter than they should at midnight. There are faint shadows beneath them now. You tell yourself you're still ahead. You haven't escalated too far. You're not running boats. You're not negotiating shipments. You're just managing opportunity. But your nervous system doesn't care about semantics. It responds to exposure, to risk, to chemicals. Driving home at dawn, you notice two police cruisers parked near an intersection. They're not there for you. Probably. But your palms sweat anyway. Miami in 1979 feels both glamorous and brittle. Construction cranes still dot the skyline. Nightclubs still fill. Cash still flows. But beneath the surface, pressure builds. Legal, psychological, physical. You unlock your apartment door and step inside. The silence feels heavier than usual. You sit on the edge of your bed, heart still racing from the drive. You're not sure whether it's the city that's on edge. Or you. You tell yourself it's just you. That the city is loud. Sure, but manageable. That the helicopters overhead are routine. That the sirens are statistical background noise. It's your own pulse that's the real problem. Your own thoughts that won't quiet down. But Miami is shifting again. And you can feel it. You're at a small dinner party in Coral Gables. Trying very hard to appear normal. The house is elegant but understated, arched doorways. Soft lighting. Classical music instead of disco. The host speaks in measured tones about international trade. The phrase floats around the table like perfume. You're seated next to a man introduced only as Carlos. He smiles politely, asks where you're from, what you do. His watch is expensive but subtle. His demeanor calm in a way that feels intentional. You don't know exactly who he represents. But you have a strong suspicion. By the late 1970s, the Medellin trafficking networks are becoming increasingly organized, professionalized. The stereotype of chaotic smugglers is giving way to structured hierarchies, transport coordinators, financiers, enforcers. Operations scale when logistics become disciplined. Historians still debate how centralized these networks truly were in this early period. Whether power flowed through a few dominant figures or remained fragmented among competing groups. But what's clear is that the machinery behind the powder on your coffee table is far more sophisticated than a handful of reckless boat captains. Carlos speaks softly about distribution efficiencies, about maintaining quality control. He never says the word cocaine. He doesn't need to. You nod more than you speak. Cocaine from earlier sharpens your attention but also amplifies your nerves. Your heartbeat feels audible in your ears. You wonder if he can see it pulsing at your neck. A lesser-known detail, during this era, Traffickers often prioritized consistency of product as a competitive advantage. Purity levels in late 1970s cocaine were frequently higher than what would dominate the market in the 1980s. Reputation mattered. Reliability mattered. Branding, in its own illicit way, mattered. The dinner continues with unsettling civility. Wine is poured. Polite laughter ripples around the table. You realize how normalized this ecosystem has become. International supply chains discussed over dessert. Millions of dollars implied between bites of tiramisu. You excuse yourself to the restroom, not for a line this time, but to breathe. You grip the marble sink and stare into the mirror. You look composed, respectable, a person who could plausibly discuss trade policy without flinching. But beneath the surface, your chest feels tight again. Cocaine constricts blood vessels, elevates blood pressure. Chronic use increases the risk of arrhythmias. Emergency departments in Miami are documenting more stimulant-related cardiac events among people who, on paper, look too young for heart trouble. You splash water on your face. Smile. Return to the table. Carlos asks you casually if you've ever considered expanding. The word lands heavily. He doesn't push. He simply plants the seed. The margins are strong. He suggests. Demand across the United States is surging. Miami is merely the gateway. He's not wrong. By the end of the 1970s, the U.S. appetite for cocaine has grown dramatically, fueled by cultural glamorization and the perception that it's less destructive than other narcotics. That perception will not age well. Historians still argue about the role of media and celebrity culture in softening public attitudes toward cocaine during this period. Films, magazine profiles, music scenes, all contributed to an aura of sophistication that masked the mounting social cost. You leave the dinner with a handshake and a business card that contains no business name. Just a number. Driving home, your thoughts spiral. The offer isn't explicit, but it's clear. Scale up, step in deeper, move from peripheral to participant. The high from earlier is fading now, replaced by a restless agitation. You roll the windows down despite the humidity. The night air sticks to your skin. At a red light, you glance in your rearview mirror and imagine, just for a moment, that the car behind you is following too closely. Your pulse spikes. The light turns green. The car turns another direction. Your imagination doesn't. Federal enforcement is intensifying quietly. Joint task forces are expanding. Financial investigations are growing more sophisticated. Undercover operations are embedding within trafficking circles. The system is learning the routes, the patterns, the players. Historians still debate whether this period represents the peak of traffickers' operational confidence before serious crackdowns reshaped the landscape. From inside the ecosystem, it feels unstoppable. From the outside, pressure is building. You reach your apartment and sit in the dark for a long moment before going inside. The business card rests in your pocket, heavy as a brick. You could ignore it, stay small, stay adjacent. But cocaine has already rewired your risk tolerance. What once felt reckless now feels strategic. What once felt dangerous now feels like opportunity. You place the card on your kitchen counter beside the envelope of cash. Two small objects, two enormous implications. Your heart beats steadily for now. But you can feel the machinery turning. The machinery doesn't announce itself with sirens. It hums quietly in the background. Like your ceiling fan, steady, patient, waiting. You don't call the number right away. You let the card sit on the counter for 2 days. Pretending it's decorative. You walk past it, glance at it, move it slightly when you wipe the surface. Each time, your pulse ticks up just a little. On the third night, after a line you promised yourself you wouldn't take, you pick up the phone. The conversation is brief, calm, efficient, no raised voices, no dramatic threats, just logistics, a meeting, a warehouse near the airport. Simple distribution. The voice says, low visibility. Low visibility. You almost laugh. Miami in 1980 feels like the opposite of low visibility. By this point, federal investigations into money laundering and trafficking networks are expanding aggressively. Operation Greenback is in full motion, targeting financial institutions suspected of facilitating illicit cash flow. Undercover agents are increasingly embedded in distribution chains, gathering evidence quietly, patiently. Historians still debate how many small players believed they were invisible during this era, how many underestimated the sophistication of federal surveillance. The illusion of anonymity can be powerful, especially when reinforced by stimulant confidence. You arrive at the warehouse just after sunset. It's nondescript, corrugated metal, faded paint, a loading dock that looks like it could house anything from furniture to fruit. Inside, fluorescent lights flicker over stacked boxes labeled with harmless descriptions. Electronics, textiles. You're introduced to 2 men who speak little but observe everything. The packages are smaller than you imagined. Wrapped tightly, efficient. You're told your role would involve temporary storage and short-distance delivery. Nothing dramatic, no speedboats, no gunfights, just movement. The rationalizations line up neatly in your mind. You're not importing, not financing, not enforcing, just moving goods. Like any other logistics job. A lesser-known operational detail from this era. Traffickers often compartmentalized roles to limit exposure. Couriers didn't always know suppliers. Storage handlers didn't always know distribution endpoints. Fragmentation reduced the damage if one link broke. It also made participants feel less responsible. You nod as the terms are explained. The money is outlined. It's more than you've ever earned legitimately in a single week. Your heart beats faster, not entirely from fear. You agree. The first delivery feels surreal in its normalcy. A duffel bag in your trunk. A short drive through neighborhoods that look entirely ordinary. Palm trees. Strip malls. Families eating dinner behind lit windows. You wonder how many cars around you are carrying something similar. Cocaine in your system sharpens every sound. The hum of your engine feels amplified. The red lights seem longer than usual. When a police cruiser appears 2 lanes over, your mouth goes dry instantly. They don't look at you. They turn at the next intersection. Your body doesn't calm down for another 10 minutes. You complete the drop. A handshake. An envelope exchanged. Quick, quiet, almost boring. And that's the dangerous part. It's boring. No cinematic chase. No dramatic confrontation. Just efficient exchange. The kind that could happen 100 times without incident. Back home. You sit on your couch staring at the new envelope of cash. It's thicker this time, heavier. Miami's homicide rate continues to climb in the background. News broadcasts mention escalating violence tied to cocaine distribution networks. The morgue struggles with capacity. Law enforcement leaders hold press conferences promising renewed efforts. Historians still argue about whether public officials truly grasp the economic entanglement at this stage, how deeply illicit money had begun influencing real estate, banking, even local politics. Untangling that web would take years. You justify your role again. You're not violent. You're not armed. You're not responsible for the gunfire. But the bag in your trunk wasn't vitamins. You take a line to celebrate. The rush floods in quickly, almost aggressively. Your confidence spikes. You start mapping future routes in your head, optimizing timing, considering scale. Cocaine doesn't just energize you, it amplifies ambition into something that feels like destiny. A friend calls, voice tight. Someone they know was arrested. Federal agents. Charges related to distribution. The tone is casual, but the fear leaks through. You reassure them. It's isolated, random, unrelated. Inside, your pulse stutters. A lesser-known legal reality, federal sentencing guidelines for drug trafficking were becoming increasingly severe as the government escalated its response to narcotics proliferation. Even peripheral involvement could carry heavy consequences if linked to larger operations. You don't dwell on that. Cocaine discourages dwelling. It prefers forward motion. Another week, another delivery, another envelope. Your sleep deteriorates further, even on nights you don't use. Your mind remains wired. You replay routes, memorize faces, analyze minor deviations. The boundary between healthy caution and chemical paranoia dissolves quietly. One evening, as you're unloading a bag into a storage unit, you catch your reflection in a dusty mirror propped against the wall. You look different, not dramatically, just harder, more alert, less at ease. Miami outside continues its neon performance, clubs packed, condos rising, boats slicing through dark water. But beneath that glow, investigations deepen, surveillance expands, files accumulate quietly in federal offices. Historians still debate how many participants sensed the tightening net before it became visible. You sense something, not a net exactly, more like pressure, subtle, persistent. You close the storage unit and slide the metal door down with a heavy clang. The sound echoes longer than it should. For the first time, you wonder if the wire you're balancing on isn't just high, but fraying. The fraying doesn't snap loudly. It whispers. You notice it in your body before you admit it in your thoughts. Your nose bleeds one morning. Not dramatically, just a thin red line in the sink that looks almost artistic against white porcelain. You stare at it longer than necessary. Cocaine constricts blood vessels. Yes. But repeated irritation damages delicate tissue. Chronic use can erode the nasal septum over time. Doctors in Miami are quietly seeing more cases of unexplained sinus infections, persistent nosebleeds, even structural damage. You blame dry air. Miami humidity be damned. At night, the glamour feels thinner. You're at another condo party overlooking Biscayne Bay. But the laughter doesn't carry the same warmth it once did. Conversations are sharper, more transactional. A man you vaguely recognize from the warehouse operation is arguing in hushed tones near the balcony. Words like shortage and interference float through the music. Someone mentions increased federal seizures at small airstrips south of the city. By 1980, enforcement efforts are intensifying in both maritime and aviation corridors. Radar coverage improves. Interagency coordination tightens. The cat and mouse game grows more sophisticated on both sides. Historians still debate whether traffickers adapted faster than regulators during this escalation phase, or whether enforcement simply needed time to gather enough evidence for large-scale prosecutions. Either way, the illusion of invulnerability is thinning. You take a line to steady yourself. The rush comes. But it's different now, less euphoric, more urgent. Your heart pounds harder, your jaw tightens faster. Instead of clarity, you feel acceleration, as if your thoughts are sprinting slightly ahead of your ability to manage them. A lesser-known neurological reality: repeated stimulant use can heighten irritability and impulsivity over time. What once felt like sharpened focus can morph into agitation. You snap at someone who interrupts you mid-sentence. You barely recognize the tone of your own voice. Later, in the bathroom, always the bathroom, you examine your reflection again. The fluorescent lighting is unforgiving. There are faint shadows beneath your eyes that no amount of disco lighting can disguise. Your cheeks look slightly hollow. You press a finger against your nostril and wince. Back in the living room, someone is talking about expansion into new cities. Atlanta, Houston, Chicago, Miami is the gateway, but the demand is nationwide. The supply chain is stretching longer, more complex. You realize how small you are in this machinery. A replaceable part. That thought unsettles you more than you expect. Cocaine amplifies ego, but it can't fully mask vulnerability. News reports are increasingly blunt. Shootings in parking lots, explosions outside warehouses, federal indictments unsealed. The Dade County morgue continues to struggle with volume. The phrase, drug war, begins appearing more frequently in headlines. Historians still argue about when Miami officially crossed from boomtown with a vice problem into national symbol of narcotics-fueled violence. There's no single date, just a gradual accumulation of headlines. You start noticing helicopters more often at night. The rhythmic thudding overhead blends with your ceiling fan's hum. Sometimes you lie awake trying to distinguish between the two. Sleep is harder now even after you use. The high tapers into a jittery plateau instead of a clean arc. You scroll through your thoughts repeatedly. Routes, contacts, amounts. You replay minor conversations, searching for hidden meanings. One evening, during a delivery, you spot an unfamiliar sedan parked across from the storage unit. Two silhouettes inside. Maybe they're just waiting for someone. Maybe they're not. Your pulse skyrockets instantly. Sweat prickles along your spine despite the air conditioning. You sit in your car for 5 full minutes before stepping out. The sedan doesn't move. You complete the drop as quickly as possible. When you return to your vehicle, the sedan is gone. You don't know if it was ever about you. Cocaine sharpens vigilance into something indistinguishable from paranoia. At another party, someone jokes that Miami should replace its city seal with a $sign and a speedboat. Laughter follows, but it's thinner than before, more brittle. A friend confides that they're thinking of leaving. Too hot, they say, not about the weather, about the pressure, the investigations, the violence. You pretend you haven't thought the same. A lesser-known social reality of addiction during this era, many users maintained outwardly functional lives for longer than expected. Jobs, apartments, social circles. The deterioration was gradual. Not always dramatic, it was the accumulation of sleepless nights, strained nerves, small compromises that did the damage. You feel the accumulation now. The cash stacks higher, but your calm erodes. The rush arrives, but satisfaction fades faster. The glamour remains visible, but it feels staged, like a set piece hiding unstable scaffolding. One night, standing alone on your balcony, you watch lightning flicker over the Atlantic in distant silence. The storm is too far to hear, but you can see it building. Miami looks radiant from above, neon reflected in black water, music drifting upward from rooftop clubs. But you know what's moving beneath that surface. Boats, cash, surveillance, suspicion. You rest your hands on the railing. They tremble slightly. The wire you're walking isn't just fraying anymore. It's vibrating. The vibration spreads outward. It's no longer confined to docks and warehouses. It's on television. It's in speeches. It's in the careful language of politicians who suddenly discovered the word narcotics. You're at a bar in Coconut Grove. The kind that still pretends it's bohemian despite the rising tide of tailored suits. The television above the counter plays a news segment about escalating drug enforcement efforts nationwide. Federal officials speak about coordination, about crackdowns, about tightening financial oversight. The tone is firm, almost rehearsed. You sip something you don't taste. Your nerves are already humming. By the late 1970s and into 1980, drug policy conversations intensify at the national level. Political pressure mounts as cocaine-related violence in cities like Miami gains widespread media attention. Lawmakers debate stricter penalties, expanded investigative powers, enhanced funding for enforcement agencies. The early architecture of what will later be called the war on drugs is solidifying. Historians still debate whether these early policy shifts were primarily reactive to public fear or driven by deeper structural concerns about international trafficking networks. Was it politics responding to headlines, or intelligence agencies responding to scale? The answer is probably both. You watch the screen as footage of seized boats flashes by. Speedboats hauled onto docks by uniformed officers. Tables covered in confiscated bricks of cocaine. The camera lingers just long enough to make the point. The bartender glances up and mutters, "Bad for business." No one clarifies which business. You step outside into humid night air. Coconut Grove smells faintly of salt and citrus. Music spills from nearby clubs. Miami refuses to dim its neon just because Washington discovered concern. You tell yourself the crackdown won't touch you. You're small, peripheral, invisible in the larger equation. But invisibility feels thinner lately. A lesser-known detail from this period: financial reporting requirements were gradually tightening. And banks were under increasing pressure to file suspicious activity reports. Structured deposits, carefully divided sums to avoid thresholds, were beginning to attract scrutiny. Patterns matter. Patterns leave trails. You think about your deposits. The tidy amounts. The regularity. Your heart rate inches upward. Not from the drink, from the thought. Later that week, you attend another meeting, less glamorous this time. No marble floors. Just folding chairs in a back room behind a storefront. The conversation is tense. Seizures have increased. A shipment intercepted offshore. A pilot arrested. The mood is different now. Less bravado. More calculation. You notice how often people say, temporarily, temporary disruption, temporary attention, temporary inconvenience. Cocaine amplifies your confidence during the meeting. You propose alternate storage rotations, shorter holding times, more flexible drop schedules. The ideas flow easily, too easily. Your mind feels like it's racing slightly ahead of your mouth. People nod. And for a moment, you feel indispensable. That's the hook. A lesser-known psychological effect of stimulant-driven environments, the sense of strategic brilliance can mask overreach. You feel sharper, faster, more adaptable, but cocaine doesn't improve judgment, it just accelerates it. Sometimes straight into a wall. Driving home, you replay the meeting in your mind. You imagine federal agents listening in. You picture microphones hidden in ceiling tiles. You laugh at yourself for the paranoia, then glance in your rearview mirror anyway. 2 cars behind you stays with you through 3 turns. Your pulse spikes. Your palms dampen. The car eventually peels off toward a residential street. You exhale slowly. Miami's homicide rate remains high. Federal indictments continue to trickle into headlines. Politicians promise decisive action. Enforcement budgets grow. Surveillance technology improves incrementally. Historians still argue about whether traffickers underestimated the long-term persistence of federal pressure. Early successes bred confidence, but institutions, once mobilized, rarely retreat quietly. You return to your apartment and sit in darkness for a while before turning on the lights. The business card from Carlos still rests in your drawer. You haven't called him again. Not yet. You tell yourself you're managing risk, scaling carefully, staying small enough to avoid notice but large enough to matter. Your chest tightens briefly again. A dull pressure. You rub it absent-mindedly. Cocaine's cardiovascular strain doesn't ask permission. It accumulates quietly. You haven't told anyone how often you feel that pressure. You step onto your balcony and look out at the skyline. Miami glows like a promise, bright, seductive, relentless. Construction cranes still puncture the horizon. Nightclubs still pulse. Boats still cut through black water. From a distance, it's all glamour. Up close, it's friction. You lean on the railing and close your eyes for a moment. The wind brushes your face. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter thuds across the sky. The city isn't just vibrating anymore. It's bracing. The bracing feels subtle at first, like the way the air shifts before a storm you can't yet see. You're driving along the Rickenbacker Causeway at dusk. Windows down, humid wind pushing through the car. The skyline glows behind you, soft and deceptive in the fading light. The radio murmurs about something else now, politics, inflation, foreign policy, but every few segments, the topic swings back to drugs, seizures, arrests, federal cooperation with local task forces. Then another story breaks. The Mariel boatlift. In 1980, thousands of Cuban refugees begin arriving in South Florida after Fidel Castro announces that those wishing to leave Cuba may depart from the port of Mariel. Over the following months, approximately 125,000 people cross the Florida Straits in crowded boats. Landing primarily in Miami, the city, already tense, already stretched, absorbs an immense humanitarian wave. Historians still debate the long-term economic and social impact of the Mariel boatlift. Some argue it strengthened Miami's labor force and cultural vibrancy. Others point to short-term strain on housing, employment, and law enforcement. In the middle of an already volatile drug landscape, the sudden population shift adds complexity to everything. You don't see it as policy or demographics. You see it in traffic, in longer lines at grocery stores, in crowded apartment complexes, in overheard conversations switching between English and Spanish with urgent speed. The city feels fuller, louder, edgier. At a warehouse meeting later that week, someone mutters that law enforcement resources are stretched thin dealing with the influx. Another person suggests it creates cover. The implication hangs there: more chaos, more distraction. You don't like how easily that thought is accepted. A lesser-known detail: while some public discourse at the time unfairly associated the Mariel refugees with rising crime, subsequent research would later complicate that narrative. The social reality was far more nuanced than the headlines suggested. But nuance rarely survives in an atmosphere already charged with fear. You're noticing fear more clearly now. Not just your own, everyone's. At a club that weekend, the energy is different. Still loud, still neon, but tighter. Conversations stop more abruptly when unfamiliar faces approach. The bathrooms feel more crowded, more urgent. Lines of powder are laid out faster, consumed faster. You take one out of habit. The rush hits, but instead of confidence, it brings acceleration layered over anxiety. Your thoughts sprint in multiple directions at once. You start outlining contingency plans in your head, alternate routes, different drop points, potential safe exits. Cocaine amplifies your sense of preparedness. It convinces you that thinking faster equals thinking better. A man you've seen at prior meetings pulls you aside. He mentions increased D activity, more unmarked cars, more informants. The Drug Enforcement Administration, established earlier in the decade, has been expanding operations in response to the cocaine boom. Task forces coordinate with customs and local police. Intelligence sharing improves incrementally. Historians still debate whether the scale of the cocaine influx in Miami during these years permanently reshaped federal narcotics strategy. The city became a laboratory of enforcement innovation. Unfortunately, it was also a laboratory of violence. You excuse yourself and step outside again, always outside. The humid air feels heavier tonight. Sirens echo faintly from somewhere inland. You think about the Mariel refugees arriving in small boats. Exhausted and hopeful, you think about the speedboats slicing through the same waters under moonlight, carrying something entirely different. The contrast unsettles you. Back inside, someone jokes that Miami is now the capital of everything. Refugees, real estate, cocaine. The laughter is uneven. Your chest tightens again, longer this time. A subtle pressure beneath your sternum. You breathe slowly, trying to steady it. Cocaine's cardiovascular effects accumulate quietly. Increased blood pressure, vasoconstriction, heightened strain. Young users aren't immune. You haven't seen a doctor. You don't want documentation. Documentation feels dangerous now. Later that night, during a short delivery run, you pass a checkpoint set up near a major intersection. Officers are stopping random vehicles. Flashlights sweep across windshields. Your pulse spikes violently. The bag in your trunk feels radioactive. When it's your turn, an officer leans toward your window. Light grazing your face. He asks where you're headed. You answer smoothly, too smoothly. Maybe. Cocaine sharpens your articulation but thins your patience. He studies you for a moment that feels like an hour. Then waves you through. You drive away slowly, hands trembling slightly on the wheel. Historians still argue about how many small participants avoided detection simply through probability, too many moving parts. Too many vehicles. Too many potential targets. Enforcement, no matter how intense, can't stop every car. You complete the drop and sit in your parked vehicle for several minutes before starting the engine again. Your heartbeat refuses to slow. Miami's skyline glows in the distance. Serene and indifferent. You used to feel energized by that glow. Now it feels like a spotlight. The city is absorbing waves of refugees, of cash, of violence, of federal scrutiny. The pressure layers on itself. And you, once balancing confidently on a wire, now feel the wind gusting harder than ever. Not enough to knock you off yet, but enough to make you wonder how much longer you can pretend this is just a phase. The wind doesn't knock you off. It just keeps pushing, steadily, persistently, until you start leaning without realizing it. You're in your apartment again. Television flickering in the dim light. The evening news has become a ritual you never intended to adopt. You tell yourself you're staying informed. Really, you're scanning for your own reflection in the chaos. Another shooting. Another warehouse raid. Another press conference with officials promising intensified enforcement. Miami is no longer just a city in headlines. It's a cautionary tale broadcast nationwide. By 1980, national media outlets frequently describe Miami as ground zero for cocaine trafficking in the United States. The homicide rate has climbed dramatically compared to earlier in the decade. Federal task forces expand. Cooperation between agencies improves, slowly knitting together intelligence that once remained fragmented. Historians still debate whether the intense media coverage accelerated policy responses, or whether policy was already accelerating and media simply amplified it. Either way, perception becomes reality. You mute the television, but the images linger. Police tape, evidence tables, confiscated boats lined up like trophies of a war that doesn't feel metaphorical anymore. Your phone rings. A friend from the warehouse circuit speaks quickly. Voice tight. Someone got picked up. Not a kingpin. Not a headline name. A mid-level coordinator. Charges include distribution and conspiracy. Federal. Conspiracy. The word echoes. A lesser-known legal detail. Conspiracy charges allow prosecutors to target networks rather than isolated acts. You don't have to be the mastermind to face serious consequences. Participation, even peripheral, can be enough if linked to a broader operation. You hang up slowly. The bag in your closet, temporary storage for tomorrow's delivery, feels heavier than usual. You didn't think twice about holding it last month. Now it hums in your imagination like unstable machinery. You decide not to use tonight. You want clarity. Clarity arrives as anxiety, without cocaine smoothing the edges. Your thoughts move slower but dig deeper. You replay every deposit at the bank, every handshake, every route. You remember the checkpoint on the intersection, the sedan outside the storage unit weeks ago. Are they building something? A case? A pattern? Historians still argue about how often federal investigations during this era relied on long-term surveillance rather than immediate arrests. Patience can be more effective than spectacle. You pace your apartment. The ceiling fan hums. Helicopter blades thud faintly in the distance. You try to convince yourself the helicopter is unrelated. It probably is. Miami's airspace is busy. Your chest tightens again, this time sharper. A brief, uncomfortable squeeze that makes you freeze mid-step. It passes within seconds, leaving behind a faint ache. Cocaine's cardiovascular strain doesn't always announce itself with dramatic collapse. Sometimes it's subtle episodes, transient chest discomfort, irregular heartbeats. Emergency physicians in South Florida have documented increasing stimulant-related cardiac complaints in patients who look outwardly healthy. You sit down slowly, breathe. The next day, you complete the delivery with mechanical precision. No detours, no improvisation. You avoid eye contact longer than usual. The exchange feels colder, less conversational. The man receiving the bag doesn't linger. He doesn't joke. He simply nods and leaves. Back in your car, you realize something. The camaraderie you once imagined in this ecosystem was mostly projection. It's transactional, replaceable, efficient. At a club that weekend, attendance feels thinner. The music is still loud, but the vibe is strained. People glance toward the entrance more frequently. Someone whispers that undercover agents have been spotted in certain venues. Another insists it's paranoia. Cocaine amplifies the argument. Voices rise quickly. Irritation flares. You watch it unfold like a spectator to your own potential future. Overconfident. Reactive. Brittle. You excuse yourself to the bathroom. Not for a line this time, but to steady your breathing. The mirror reflects a face that looks slightly older than it did a year ago. Not in wrinkles, in tension. You remember your first night here. The neon glow, the electric confidence, the sense that Miami was sprinting and you were lucky enough to keep pace. Now the sprint feels like a treadmill set too high. You're running, but not moving forward. On the drive home, you pass another news van parked outside a crime scene. Yellow tape flutters in the humid breeze. Flashbulbs pop. The city feels hyper-aware of itself now, like it's watching its own reflection and not entirely liking what it sees. Historians still debate whether Miami's cocaine era permanently altered its global image or whether the city simply absorbed the shock and reinvented itself. But in this moment, reinvention feels distant. You park and sit in darkness again. The business card from Carlos is still in your drawer. The warehouse contacts still expect reliability. The bank still accepts deposits, so far. Your heart beats steadily, but you no longer trust its rhythm. You're not balancing anymore. You're bracing for impact. Impact doesn't always arrive as a crash. Sometimes it arrives as a rumor. You're halfway through a delivery week when the whispers start moving faster than the boats ever did. A new form, cheaper, smokable, faster high, different market. Crack, someone says in a low voice, like they're testing the word for sharp edges. In the early 1980s, cocaine begins shifting form in certain markets. By processing powder cocaine with baking soda and water into a smokable rock, dealers create a cheaper, more accessible product that produces a shorter but more intense high. The economics change. The audience changes. The social consequences multiply. Historians still debate how quickly this transformation reshaped urban drug markets, and whether early warning signs were underestimated. What begins as a chemical tweak becomes a cultural earthquake. You don't see it immediately in your circles. The condo parties still feature powder on glass tables. Linen suits still lean over mirrored surfaces. But the conversations shift subtly. There's talk of expanding distribution into neighborhoods previously untouched. Different clientele, someone says. Faster turnover. The phrase makes your stomach tighten. A lesser-known fact, the pharmacokinetics of smoked cocaine differ from intranasal use. The onset is nearly immediate. The intensity sharp and brief, often increasing the cycle of repeated use in shorter intervals. More cycles, more volatility. You've already felt volatility in yourself. You don't like imagining it amplified citywide. At a meeting in the warehouse, the tone is pragmatic. Powder remains profitable, but diversification is mentioned. Testing new markets, adjusting supply chains. The machinery is adapting again. You sit quietly, pulse elevated even without using. Your body is permanently tuned slightly too high now, like a radio just off frequency. Later that night, you take a line anyway. Habit, escape. The rush arrives, but it feels thinner, less euphoric. Your brain seems to expect more than chemistry can deliver. You remember when one line felt like stepping into sunlight. Now it feels like flipping on a fluorescent bulb, bright, harsh, artificial. Your chest flutters briefly again. A skipped beat, then another. You pause mid-conversation, hand unconsciously pressing against your sternum. No one notices. The music is too loud. Emergency departments in Miami are increasingly aware of stimulant-related arrhythmias and chest pain presentations. Young patients, sometimes otherwise healthy. Cocaine doesn't negotiate with age. You step outside for air. The city feels heavier lately. The Mariel influx has altered neighborhoods. Enforcement has intensified. Media scrutiny continues. And now the product itself is mutating. Historians still argue about whether the crack epidemic was an inevitable byproduct of market forces or a specific strategic shift within trafficking networks. Either way, its social impact would prove devastating in communities already vulnerable. You think about the mall shooting, the helicopters, the checkpoint, the business card, the bank deposits. Everything is accelerating. Inside the club, someone laughs too loudly at nothing. Another person snaps at a bartender over a minor delay. Irritability feels contagious. Cocaine's psychological edge is no longer subtle. You drive home early, an unusual decision. The streets are damp from a brief rain shower. Street lights reflect in broken patterns on asphalt. At a red light, you glance at your reflection in the rearview mirror. Your eyes look alert but tired, wired but worn. You remember the first night you arrived in Miami. The glow, the promise, the naive thought that you could ride the wave without getting pulled under. Now the wave feels choppier, less predictable. Back in your apartment, you sit on the edge of your bed without turning on the television. The ceiling fan hums steadily. You focus on matching your breathing to its rhythm. You tell yourself you could step back, reduce involvement, withdraw gradually. But the cash still arrives. The expectations still exist. The machinery still turns. And your nervous system, conditioned by months of stimulant surges, struggles with stillness. Miami outside continues glowing. Boats still move. Deals still happen. Policies still tighten. But something fundamental has shifted. The powder that once symbolized glamour is evolving into something harsher, faster, more chaotic. And you can feel, deep in your chest, not just the arrhythmia, but the truth. That the era you thought you understood is about to become something far more unstable. Unstable doesn't explode overnight. It erodes. Quietly. Personally. You notice it first in your relationships. Not dramatic breakups. Not shouting matches in parking lots. Just small fractures. Your sister calls from out of state, asking why you sound tired all the time. You tell her you're busy. Miami's booming. You say, opportunity everywhere. You don't mention that you haven't slept more than 4 consecutive hours in months. A friend from before all this, before the boats and warehouses and structured deposits, invites you to dinner. You cancel last minute because a delivery window shifted. You tell yourself it's temporary. He stops inviting you after the 3rd cancellation. Addiction rarely announces itself with a label. It disguises itself as scheduling conflict, as ambition, as just this season. A lesser-known psychological pattern of stimulant dependency. Users often maintain outward productivity longer than expected, masking the erosion beneath. You're still showing up, still delivering, still depositing, but your internal landscape feels narrower, more focused on maintaining equilibrium than experiencing anything genuine. At the warehouse meeting this week, tension crackles in the air. One of the mid-level coordinators hasn't been seen in days. No official word, just absence. Someone shrugs and says he went quiet. Historians still debate how many disappearances during Miami's cocaine boom were the result of law enforcement versus internal discipline within trafficking networks. Silence often covered both. You don't ask questions. You've learned not to. Instead, you focus on logistics, shorter storage times, rotating drop points more frequently. The system tightens around uncertainty like a muscle bracing for impact. Later, at a smaller party, less glamorous now, more strategic, you watch 2 men argue over a missed payment. Their voices escalate quickly. One slams a glass down hard enough to crack it. Everyone laughs nervously. The tension lingers. Cocaine sharpens irritability, heightens ego, reduces patience. You feel it in yourself too. A bartender takes too long with your drink, and you snap at him before you can stop yourself. His expression shifts. Annoyance. Maybe recognition. You've become that guy. You step into the bathroom and stare at your reflection. Again, the ritual is almost comforting now. Your nose is perpetually irritated. A faint whistle when you breathe deeply. You press gently against the bridge and feel tenderness. Chronic intranasal cocaine use can damage mucosal lining and cartilage over time. You read that once in a health pamphlet at a clinic and laughed. You're not laughing now. Back in the main room, someone is talking about crack spreading in certain neighborhoods. Faster money, shorter cycles, more volatility. The tone is pragmatic, not moral. Historians still argue about whether the rapid expansion of crack markets in the early 1980s intensified violence due to compressed profit cycles and territorial disputes. The economics of shorter highs often meant faster turnover and faster conflict. You drive home alone. Miami's streets feel different at night now. More police cruisers, more news vans, More flashing lights reflected in puddles. You remember when you used to feel energized by this city's pace. Now it feels like a treadmill stuck at maximum incline. At home, you sit on the edge of your bed and consider not using tonight. You last almost an hour. Then the restlessness creeps in, low-grade anxiety humming beneath your skin. You tell yourself a small line will steady you, just enough to take the edge off. The rush arrives, but it's muted, familiar, routine. You realize something unsettling. You're no longer chasing euphoria. You're chasing normal. A lesser-known feature of stimulant tolerance, over time. Users may increase frequency not to feel elevated, but to avoid feeling low. The baseline shifts upward artificially, and maintaining it becomes the goal. Your phone buzzes. A message from the warehouse contact. Be careful. Increased eyes. Increased eyes. You walk to the window and part the blinds slightly. The parking lot below looks ordinary. A few cars. A flickering street lamp. Nothing dramatic. But you feel watched anyway. Historians still debate the extent to which paranoia among participants during this era was justified versus chemically amplified. In high-risk environments, suspicion can be both rational and pathological at the same time. Your chest flutters again, another brief arrhythmic stutter. You sit down quickly, breathe slowly. It passes. You imagine going to a doctor, describing the symptoms, the sleeplessness, the anxiety, but documentation feels like exposure. Exposure feels dangerous. So you sit in the dim light instead, listening to the ceiling fan hum. Miami outside continues its strange dual performance, luxury condos rising while helicopters circle overhead. Nightclubs pulsing while indictments stack quietly in federal offices. Boats moving across dark water while families settle into small apartments after long journeys from Cuba. Everything layered, everything overlapping. And you, once convinced you were surfing the wave, now feel like you're just trying not to drown in the undertow. The undertow is quiet. That's what makes it dangerous. It doesn't pull with drama. It pulls with repetition. You wake up before your alarm again. Heart already ticking too fast for someone who hasn't moved. The room is dim. Humid air pressing softly against the windows. For a few seconds, you don't remember where you are. Then the weight settles back in. Deliveries. Deposits. Whispered warnings. You sit up slowly. There's a faint tremor in your hands. You tell yourself it's caffeine. You haven't had any yet. A lesser-known effect of chronic stimulant use is something called anhedonia, a reduced ability to feel pleasure from ordinary activities. Breakfast tastes muted. Music sounds flatter. Even the ocean breeze feels like background noise instead of invitation. You notice it now when you walk past the beach and feel nothing. Miami used to feel electric. Now it feels like static. The deliveries continue, but they're shorter, tighter, more cautious. The warehouse rotates locations more frequently. Storage units change. Vehicles change. The system adapts to pressure. Federal enforcement continues adapting too. Surveillance techniques grow more refined. Financial tracking improves incrementally. Undercover operations deepen. Historians still debate whether this period represents a stalemate, traffickers and authorities both escalating in sophistication, or whether the balance was already tipping quietly toward law enforcement. From inside the machinery, it's impossible to see the full board. You attend a smaller gathering tonight. Not a club. Just a condo with drawn curtains and low music. The powder is still there, but the mood is subdued. Fewer jokes, fewer grand declarations about expansion. Someone mentions a major seizure offshore. Another mentions indictments unsealed quietly, without dramatic press conferences. You feel the undertow again. You take a line out of reflex. The burn is sharper than you remember. The rush comes, but instead of confidence, you feel something closer to agitation. Your thoughts race, but they circle the same themes: risk, exposure, escape. Across the room, two men argue about trust. One accuses the other of talking too freely at a bar last week. Voices rise. Cocaine amplifies ego. It compresses patience. Small slights expand into threats. You slip out onto the balcony. The humid night wraps around you. The skyline glows, indifferent and immaculate from a distance. You remember your first weeks here, the laughter, the thrill of speedboats slicing across moonlit water. You remember thinking you were lucky to witness the engine of a booming city. Now you see the smoke. A lesser-known social shift during this era, as crack markets began expanding. Violence in certain neighborhoods intensified dramatically, altering community dynamics and increasing strain on local law enforcement. The ripple effects were uneven but profound. You don't deal crack. You tell yourself that matters. You stay in powder distribution, higher tier. Someone once called it, the distinction feels thinner every week. Your chest tightens again, longer this time, a dull pressure spreading slightly into your shoulder before fading. You lean against the railing until it passes. You consider going to a hospital, just to check, but you imagine paperwork, questions, insurance forms, maybe even a drug screen. Documentation feels like a liability. So you breathe slowly and return inside. Later, during a delivery, you notice something new. You're not just scanning for police anymore. You're scanning for everyone: pedestrians, neighbors, security cameras. You catalog every detail instinctively. Hypervigilance feels productive in the moment, but it's exhausting. Historians still argue about the long-term psychological toll on participants who weren't arrested, weren't shot, weren't publicly exposed, but lived for years in high-risk ecosystems. Chronic stress leaves marks that don't show up in headlines. You feel those marks in your sleep. When you finally drift off, dreams are fragmented, sirens blending with disco lights, helicopters merging with ceiling fans. One afternoon, you run into your old friend, the one who stopped inviting you to dinner. He studies you quietly. You look different, he says, not accusing, just observing. You shrug it off. New haircut, busy schedule, Miami life. He doesn't argue. He just nods slowly, as if filing something away. Back home, you sit at your kitchen table staring at the business card from Carlos. You still haven't expanded, not fully. You've stayed mid-level, manageable. But manageable feels unstable now. The cash stacks higher in your drawer. The bank deposits continue, carefully structured, carefully timed. The undertow pulls again, not dramatically, just steadily. You realize something uncomfortable. You're no longer motivated by excitement or ambition. You're motivated by inertia, by the difficulty of stopping. Miami outside continues glowing. But inside, the static grows louder. And somewhere deep in your chest, not just in the arrhythmic flutter, But in something more permanent, you sense that the current beneath you isn't just pulling toward consequences. It's pulling toward collapse. Collapse doesn't begin with sirens. It begins with subtraction. One contact stops answering calls. Another says he's taking a break. A third is suddenly very careful about meeting locations, insisting on public places that feel anything but public. The warehouse you've used for months rotates again, this time abruptly. No discussion, just a new address texted late at night. The message ends with, "Don't ask." You don't. By the early 1980s, federal pressure in South Florida intensifies further. Joint task forces expand surveillance. Undercover operations deepen. Financial investigations grow more patient and methodical. Arrests aren't always immediate. Sometimes they follow months of observation. Historians still debate how many trafficking networks unraveled because of long-term infiltration versus internal mistrust. In ecosystems built on secrecy, paranoia can be as destructive as prosecution. You feel both closing in. At a meeting in the new location, a smaller, more isolated storage unit, you notice fewer faces. The energy is brittle. Conversations are short. Someone mentions increased presence near the airport. Another mentions customs inspections tightening at ports. The Drug Enforcement Administration has made Miami a focal point of operations. Surveillance aircraft, informants, coordinated raids. The machinery is no longer theoretical. You nod, speak minimally, focus on efficiency. Cocaine has lost its glamour entirely now. You don't use to celebrate. You use to stabilize. The rush no longer feels like sunlight, it feels like temporary scaffolding holding up a shaky structure. A lesser-known physiological reality, chronic stimulant use increases baseline anxiety even when not actively intoxicated. Your nervous system remains primed for threat. Hypervigilance becomes default. During a short delivery run, you notice a black sedan parked 2 houses down from the drop point. You've seen that model before. Maybe not the same car, but similar. Your heart leaps violently. You circle the block once. Twice. The sedan remains. You abort the drop and drive away. Pulse hammering in your throat. Later, you learn it was likely unrelated. A neighbor's guest. A coincidence. But coincidence feels dangerous now. Historians still argue about how many participants self-sabotaged operations because paranoia, chemically amplified, led to erratic decisions. In high-pressure environments, miscalculation compounds quickly. You reschedule the drop. The recipient isn't pleased. His patience is thin. You getting nervous? He asks casually. You smile tightly. Just careful. Inside, you're unraveling. Your sleep has deteriorated further. Even after using, your rest is shallow. You wake frequently. Heart racing. Mind scanning imaginary threats. One night, you wake convinced you heard someone at your door. You sit frozen in the dark. Listening. Nothing. Just the refrigerator humming and distant traffic. You don't go back to sleep. The next day, news breaks of another major seizure, boats intercepted offshore. Dozens of kilos confiscated. Press conferences highlight cooperation between agencies. Cameras capture stacks of wrapped bricks on folding tables. You stare at the screen and imagine your own packages lined up like that. Evidence tags. Photographs. Courtrooms. Conspiracy charges. A lesser-known legal detail. Federal sentencing during this era could aggregate quantities across related transactions, meaning even smaller participants might face severe penalties if tied to larger conspiracies. Scale matters. Association matters. You begin quietly reducing your involvement. Fewer deliveries, shorter storage windows. You tell contacts you're focusing on other projects. Some understand, some don't. One evening, a contact you barely know corners you at a low-lit bar. He studies your face carefully. You stepping back. You deflect. Say you're diversifying. He nods slowly, but his eyes linger too long. Trust feels thinner than ever. Cocaine tonight feels different again, less effective, more demanding. You take a line and feel your heart slam painfully hard for a few seconds. A flutter follows. You grip the edge of the bar until it stabilizes. Emergency rooms in Miami continue documenting stimulant-related cardiac events. Young men clutching their chests in waiting rooms. Some survive, some don't. You leave the bar early. Driving home, you realize something has shifted decisively inside you. The fear isn't abstract anymore. It's physical, palpable, measurable in heartbeats. Miami's skyline still glows beautifully against the night. Condos continue rising. Nightclubs still pulse. Boats still move. But the circle you once stood inside is shrinking. Faces disappearing. Trust eroding. Enforcement tightening. The collapse isn't dramatic. It's subtraction. And you can feel yourself slowly being subtracted from the illusion you once thought you controlled. Subtraction leaves space. And space, you're discovering, is uncomfortable. You've reduced your runs. Fewer calls. Fewer meetings. The envelopes of cash are thinner now. And oddly enough, that makes you breathe a little easier. Less volume means less exposure. At least that's the theory you repeat to yourself at night. But stepping back doesn't feel clean. It feels watched. You're at a waterfront mansion again, white stucco glowing under soft exterior lights. Yachts lined up behind it like polished trophies. The party is smaller than the ones you remember from 2 years ago. Fewer faces, tighter circles. The extravagance feels forced, like someone trying to prove the music hasn't slowed. Inside, marble floors reflect chandelier light. Crystal glasses clink. Cocaine still sits on a glass coffee table beside imported cigars. But the laughter is thinner. A man you once saw boasting about speedboats now speaks quietly about legal fees. Another mentions moving assets overseas. Offshore accounts. Properties under relatives' names. A lesser-known financial reality of this era, as scrutiny intensified. Some individuals attempted to shield assets through shell companies, foreign banking relationships, or layered ownership structures. Financial cat and mouse became as strategic as maritime smuggling. Historians still debate how much illicit wealth from Miami's cocaine boom permanently embedded itself in legitimate industries, real estate, hospitality, banking, and how much evaporated through seizures and legal battles. Untangling money is harder than seizing product. You stand near the balcony doors, watching boats rock gently in the dark water. The mansion feels less like triumph and more like insulation, layers of luxury meant to buffer against consequences. Someone hands you a rolled bill. You hesitate longer than usual. You take the line anyway. The rush arrives, but it's sharp and brittle. Your heart accelerates instantly, too fast. You swallow hard. Pretending it's normal. You used to feel invincible during these moments. Now you feel fragile, like a glass balanced on the edge of a table. Across the room, a heated argument sparks over territory: who controls which neighborhoods? Who's stepping into whose roots? The tone escalates quickly. One man's hand slams against the table. Another steps forward, jaw clenched. Violence isn't present, but it's implied. Historians still argue about how territorial disputes intensified as crack markets expanded and distribution chains compressed. Shorter supply cycles meant faster conflict. The economics grew more volatile. You slip onto the balcony for air. Again, it's become your ritual exit from tension. The humid breeze carries faint diesel fumes from the marina. The skyline glows in the distance. Beautiful. Distant. Indifferent. You think about how this mansion, these boats, these chandeliers, all of it, exist because of powder and risk. And you realize something unsettling: none of it looks peaceful. A lesser-known psychological shift in chronic users is the erosion of awe. Things that once felt dazzling, luxury, speed, money, begin to feel hollow. The dopamine spike fades faster. The emotional return diminishes. Inside, the argument subsides into stiff laughter. Someone makes a joke about retirement. Early, sunny, tax-free. You almost laugh. Retirement requires surviving the present. Your chest tightens again, longer this time. A firm pressure that makes you lean against the railing and breathe slowly. It passes, but leaves behind a faint ache that lingers like a warning. Emergency physicians in Miami are by now well aware of cocaine's cardiac risks. Vasospasm, arrhythmias, acute coronary events in people far younger than expected. You've read enough to know the terminology. You've chosen not to act on it. You return inside and avoid the table this time. The powder remains untouched by you for the rest of the night. Driving home, you pass a billboard advertising luxury condos with slogans about the future of Miami. You wonder how much of that future is financed by the present you've been part of. Historians still debate whether Miami's skyline of the 1980s would look the same without cocaine money accelerating development. Construction boomed, banks swelled, infrastructure expanded, but at what cost? You park and sit in silence. No music, no television, just the soft ticking of your cooling engine. You realize you're tired, not just physically, but structurally. Tired of scanning mirrors, tired of calibrating deposits, tired of calibrating your own pulse. You're no longer tempted by expansion. You're tempted by quiet. But quiet feels foreign now, almost suspicious. The mansion lights still glow in your mind as you step into your apartment. You look around at your modest space, the blinds, the humming fan, the drawer with cash. Luxury suddenly seems less impressive than stability. And for the first time since you arrived in this neon city, you ask yourself a question that feels heavier than any envelope. What if survival, not profit, is the only victory left? Survival starts to sound less like a goal and more like a negotiation. You wake up one morning with a dull, steady ache behind your eyes and a decision forming quietly in the background. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a shift. You're sitting at your kitchen table, staring at the cash in the drawer. It doesn't sparkle anymore. It looks like paper, paper that costs sleep, paper that accelerates your heart, paper that might one day appear in an evidence photograph. You don't call Carlos. You don't call the warehouse contact. Instead, you call no one. By the early 1980s, stories about figures like Pablo Escobar begin circulating widely in the United States. The Medellin cartel's growing power becomes part of the narrative shaping public understanding of the cocaine trade. Names turn into myths. Myths turn into headlines. Historians still debate how much of the early mythology surrounding cartel leaders was exaggerated in media portrayals versus grounded in documented operations. What's certain is that the scale of profit and violence attached to those names amplified both fascination and fear. You realize something sobering. You were never close to that level of power. You were closer to risk than to legend. At a small cafe in Little Havana, you meet a former contact who's already stepped back. He looks thinner, but calmer. He says he's out. No details. Just out. You ask how. He shrugs. You just stop showing up. It sounds simple. It isn't. A lesser-known reality of stepping away from illicit networks, absence can be suspicious. Silence can be interpreted as disloyalty. Exits must be gradual, non-dramatic, unthreatening. You can't burn bridges, you have to let them cool. You begin declining minor requests. Busy, traveling, family issues. You reduce your availability without announcing departure. Your income shrinks immediately. The drawer empties slowly as rent. Utilities. Groceries reclaim their place in your life. It feels strangely grounding to pay bills with money that isn't wrapped in anxiety. But the cravings remain. Cocaine has rewired your evenings. Around 9 p.m., your body expects acceleration. Your mind anticipates the ritual. Without it, restlessness creeps in like a tide. A lesser-known neurological detail, recovery from stimulant dependency often involves a prolonged period of dysregulation, low mood, fatigue, irritability, while dopamine systems recalibrate. It's not immediate relief, it's endurance. You pace your apartment. The ceiling fan hums. The helicopter overhead passes. And for once, your heart doesn't spike quite as violently. You think about the Dadeland shooting, the checkpoint, the warehouse meetings, the mansion arguments. You realize survival isn't passive. It requires deliberate subtraction. News reports continue. Crack spreads further in certain neighborhoods. Federal indictments expand. Task forces deepen investigations. Miami remains a focal point of national attention. Historians still debate whether the city's identity was permanently reshaped during these years, or whether it simply evolved under pressure. You're evolving too. You run into the linen suit man at a grocery store. He looks older, tired. His smile is thinner. He asks if you're still active. You shake your head lightly, taking a break. He studies you for a moment, then nods. Smart, he says quietly. Smart feels different than ambitious. That night, you sit on your balcony without music, without powder, without urgency. The skyline glows as it always has. Boats still move across dark water, but you're not on them. Your chest flutters briefly again, a reminder, not a crisis. You breathe slowly until it settles. You consider seeing a doctor. You consider telling the truth. You're not ready for that yet, but you're closer than you were. The undertow still exists. The machinery still turns, but you've stepped slightly out of its direct current. For the first time in a long while, the silence in your apartment doesn't feel threatening. It feels fragile. And fragile, you're learning, can be protected. Fragile things require patience. You're discovering that stepping back from the trade is one thing. Stepping back from the drug itself is another. The deliveries have stopped. The late-night warehouse texts have faded. But around 8:45 p.m., your body still hums with expectation. Like a theater audience waiting for curtains to rise. Only now, nothing rises. You sit on your couch. Hands restless. Television on but muted. The silence is louder than the clubs ever were. A lesser-known aspect of cocaine withdrawal isn't dramatic collapse, it's depletion. Fatigue that feels bone-deep. Mood dips that flatten color. Concentration that wobbles. Your brain, accustomed to artificial surges of dopamine, recalibrates slowly. You feel dull, heavy, uninspired. Miami outside still glitters. News continues reporting on indictments, expanded task forces, and increased sentencing guidelines as the federal government intensifies its drug enforcement strategy. The war on drugs rhetoric grows firmer, louder, policies harden, penalties increase. Historians still debate the long-term effectiveness of these escalating enforcement strategies, whether they reduced supply meaningfully or displaced it geographically. But on the ground, one thing is clear: consequences are no longer abstract. You run into an old warehouse contact at a gas station. He looks over his shoulder before speaking. You picked a good time to disappear. He mutters. Why? More eyes than ever. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. You drive home with your pulse elevated, not from guilt this time, but from proximity to a life you're trying to leave behind. You realize how narrow your margin was. One more run, one more mistake. That night, the cravings hit harder than usual. You pace your apartment. You open the drawer where you once kept cash and find it nearly empty. You run your fingers along the wood grain where envelopes used to sit. Your mind whispers, just one line, just to feel normal again. But you know what normal has become. A lesser-known neurological fact: stimulant cravings can be triggered by environmental cues, locations, times of day, even certain music. Your brain has built associations that don't dissolve overnight. You step onto the balcony instead. The humid air presses gently against your skin. The skyline looks softer tonight. Less sharp, almost forgiving. Your chest flutters again, but less violently. You've noticed the episodes are shorter when you haven't used. That realization lingers. For the first time, you seriously consider seeing a doctor, not because you're afraid of being caught, but because you're afraid of what your heart might be learning from you. Meanwhile, Miami continues transforming. Crack markets expand further into neighborhoods far from waterfront mansions. Violence shifts geographically but doesn't vanish. Federal sentencing grows stricter. News anchors use phrases like epidemic without irony. Historians still argue about how public perception of cocaine shifted so dramatically, from glamorous indulgence to national crisis, in just a few years. Cultural narratives can pivot quickly when consequences become visible. You remember when powder felt sophisticated, when speedboats felt thrilling, when linen suits felt aspirational. Now, those images feel like stage props from a play that ran too long. You start walking in the mornings, something simple, repetitive, grounded, no deliveries, no scanning mirrors, just footsteps along the sidewalk. At first, It feels pointless. Your brain protests the lack of intensity. But gradually, you notice something subtle. The world regains texture. The ocean breeze feels cooler. Coffee tastes slightly richer. Music carries nuance again. The recalibration is slow, uneven. One evening, you receive a message from someone still active in distribution. Need help. Short notice. Your pulse jumps reflexively. The old circuitry fires instantly. Easy money, quick run, temporary surge. You stare at the message for a long time. Then you delete it. It's not heroic. It's not dramatic. It's just subtraction. That night, you sleep 4 uninterrupted hours. It feels like a miracle. The ceiling fan hums. Helicopters pass somewhere far away. But your body doesn't leap at every sound. Miami remains complex, glamour layered over consequence, growth layered over strain. Historians will debate for decades how deeply the cocaine era reshaped its institutions, its skyline, its psyche. But your focus has narrowed. Not to profit, not to expansion, to survival. And for the first time in years, survival doesn't feel like bracing. It feels like choosing. Choosing feels quieter than you expected. There's no parade when you wake up without craving the night before. No applause when you delete a contact instead of replying. It's just morning light through half-open blinds and the steady hum of your ceiling fan. You've started seeing a doctor. Not dramatically, not confessing everything at once. Just describing the chest tightness, the flutters, the insomnia. He asks about stimulant use. You hesitate, then nod. He doesn't look shocked. In early 1980s Miami, he's seen enough to recognize the pattern. Cocaine-related cardiac symptoms have become familiar: vasospasms, arrhythmias, elevated blood pressure in patients far younger than textbooks once predicted. A lesser-known medical truth: many stimulant-induced cardiac irregularities improve with cessation. But prolonged use can leave lasting effects. The body recalibrates slowly, and not always perfectly. You sit in the exam room listening to your own heartbeat amplified through a stethoscope. It sounds fragile and mechanical at the same time. Outside the clinic, the city keeps moving. News headlines discuss expanded federal indictments, major money laundering cases, and the deepening national conversation around the war on drugs. Crack markets are spreading rapidly through certain communities, and with them, cycles of violence that feel more compressed, more explosive. Historians still debate how much of this escalation was preventable, whether early policy decisions shaped the trajectory or merely reacted to it. What's undeniable is that Miami remains a symbol in the national imagination: neon, speedboats, headlines, consequence. You feel oddly distant from it now. Not immune, just removed by inches instead of miles. At a grocery store, you see a familiar face from the old warehouse meetings. He avoids eye contact. You don't press it. Silence is safer than nostalgia. A lesser-known social pattern in illicit economies: when participants step away quietly, they often disappear from each other's lives just as quietly. There are no exit interviews, no farewell speeches, just absence. Your evenings are changing. You still feel restless sometimes, especially when certain songs play, music that once accompanied bathroom mirrors and silver trays. But the cravings no longer feel like commands. They feel like echoes. You've replaced nightclubs with long walks along the water. Replaced powder with deep breaths of humid air. It sounds sentimental, you know, but your nervous system responds differently now. Less spike, more steadiness. One afternoon, you sit on a bench overlooking Biscayne Bay and watch boats move across the horizon. Some are recreational, some might not be. The water doesn't distinguish. You think about the Dadeland Mall, the speedboats, the mansions built on quick margins, the structured bank deposits, the helicopter blades at night. You realize you were never at the center of the storm. You were in its outer bands, close enough to feel the wind, far enough to pretend you were safe. Historians still argue about whether the cocaine era permanently altered Miami's identity or whether it simply accelerated trends already in motion: financial growth, international influence, demographic transformation. The skyline rising today doesn't advertise its origins. It just stands there, glass reflecting sunlight. Your chest flutters occasionally still, but less often. The episodes are shorter, manageable. You take medication now, nothing dramatic. Just enough to stabilize blood pressure. It feels oddly grounding to follow a prescription instead of improvising chemistry. You begin rebuilding small things. Calling your sister back more regularly. Meeting your old friend for dinner without canceling. Eating meals that don't feel optional. A lesser-known reality of recovery: boredom can feel threatening at first. Without artificial intensity, life can seem muted, but gradually, subtlety returns as texture rather than emptiness. One evening, you drive past a club you used to frequent. The neon still flickers. The bass still pulses faintly through the walls. For a moment, nostalgia brushes against you, brief, seductive. Then it passes. Inside, someone is probably leaning over a mirror right now, believing they're sharper than consequences. You don't judge them, you remember being that person. You park at home and step onto your balcony. The skyline glows as always. Boats move across black water. Miami hasn't stopped being Miami. But you have stopped trying to keep pace with its most dangerous rhythms. The city will continue evolving. Policies will shift. Historians will argue. Skyscrapers will rise where warehouses once stood. And you, once balanced on a fraying wire, are finally standing on something solid. Not glamorous. Just steady. Steady doesn't mean untouched. It just means upright. You're back in Little Havana on a humid afternoon. Sunlight bouncing off pastel buildings. Spanish radio drifting through open shop doors. The city feels layered here. Older than the condos. More grounded than the waterfront mansions. You sit at a small cafe. Stirring coffee slowly. Watching people move past. Families. Workers. Elderly men arguing gently over dominoes. Life happening without urgency. Miami in the early 1980s is still turbulent. Federal indictments continue. Crack markets expand. Sentencing guidelines stiffen, but everyday life persists between headlines. Historians still debate how much of Miami's institutional culture was permanently shaped by the cocaine era. Financial regulations tightened. Law enforcement tactics evolved. Media narratives hardened. But ordinary routines, cafes, beaches, small businesses, never fully disappeared. You're noticing ordinary again. Your chest hasn't fluttered in 3 days. You measure that quietly, like a private victory. You've cut caffeine. You take your prescribed medication. You avoid old neighborhoods at night. You also avoid the marina. The marina used to feel like possibility, engines revving, boats slicing into moonlight. Now it feels like a memory you don't need to revisit. A lesser-known physiological fact: after sustained stimulant use, the nervous system can remain hypersensitive for months. Stress responses may spike more easily. Recovery isn't linear, it's uneven. You feel that unevenness in subtle waves. Some evenings, anxiety brushes against you unexpectedly. A loud noise still startles you more than it should. A helicopter passing overhead can still make your shoulders tighten before your mind catches up. But the spikes are shorter. You receive news that another former contact has been indicted: conspiracy, distribution, money laundering, federal charges. The headlines mention quantities that sound abstract until you imagine them stacked in a warehouse. You sit with the information quietly. Historians still argue about how many mid-level participants believed they were too small to attract federal attention. Scale isn't always measured by ambition. Sometimes it's measured by association. You feel the thin margin that once separated you from those headlines. A missed turn, a different week, a single wiretap conversation. Instead of spiraling, you breathe. You've started running in the mornings, slow, awkward miles along the water. At first, your lungs protested. Your heart pounded irregularly. Now, it beats more evenly, predictably. There's something grounding about a heartbeat earned through effort instead of chemistry. One evening, you meet your old friend for dinner again. This time, you stay, you listen, you laugh without scanning the room for exits. He doesn't ask for explanations. He just seems relieved you're present. A lesser-known social truth: rebuilding trust often requires consistency rather than confession. Showing up repeatedly can matter more than recounting every mistake. You pass a new high-rise under construction on your way home. Glass and steel climbing toward the sky. It's impossible to know which dollars helped finance which floors. Miami's growth is complex, layered, entangled. Historians will continue debating the legacy: how cocaine money intersected with legitimate capital, how enforcement reshaped the financial sector, how cultural identity evolved under pressure. You're less interested in the macro view now. Your focus is smaller. Eat, sleep, breathe, repeat. On your balcony that night, the skyline looks less like a spotlight and more like a landscape. Boats move quietly in the distance. Somewhere out there, trade still happens, legal and otherwise. But you are not on those boats. Your heart beats steadily, not perfect, not invincible, just steady. And for the first time since you stepped onto that humid sidewalk in 1977, Miami feels less like a wave to surf, and more like a city you can simply live in. Living in it instead of racing through it feels almost foreign. You drive past South Beach one evening. Windows down, salt air drifting in, neon still flickers against pastel facades. Clubs still pulse. Tourists still chase the idea of Miami as a glittering playground. From the outside, very little seems to have changed. But you know what used to hum beneath that glow. By the early to mid-1980s, Miami's cocaine era has fully embedded itself in the national imagination. Media portrayals amplify the drama: speedboats, violence, excess. Eventually, Hollywood will crystallize that image in films like Scarface, turning parts of this chaotic chapter into stylized myth. Historians still debate how much those portrayals shaped public memory versus distorted it. Real life rarely comes with orchestral soundtracks and perfectly timed explosions. It comes with insomnia, with structured bank deposits, with quiet paranoia. You park near the beach and walk along the sand. The ocean is calmer than you remember. Or maybe you are. A lesser-known psychological shift in recovery is the gradual return of long-term thinking. When you were deep inside the trade, everything operated in short cycles, deliveries, deposits, nights. Now you're thinking in months, years. You've taken a steady job. Nothing glamorous. Consistent hours. Predictable pay. It feels almost revolutionary to plan around a schedule that doesn't depend on coded phone calls. The first paycheck felt small compared to what you once handled in envelopes. But it also felt clean. You remember how cocaine once sharpened your sense of possibility, made you believe you were destined for something bigger, faster, brighter. That illusion was intoxicating in ways the drug itself barely matched. Now, ambition feels quieter, less explosive, more sustainable. Your chest still flutters occasionally, usually when you're stressed or tired, but it no longer dominates your attention. You follow up with your doctor regularly. You track your blood pressure. You drink water instead of rum at night. These small adjustments would have bored you years ago. Now they feel like maintenance of something fragile and valuable. Miami continues evolving. Enforcement has reshaped distribution routes. Crack markets have left scars in communities that will take decades to redress. Financial regulations have tightened. Banks operate with more scrutiny. Historians still argue about whether the cocaine boom permanently accelerated Miami's economic transformation, or whether it was a volatile catalyst in a city already poised for growth. The skyline doesn't carry footnotes. You pass by a marina one afternoon. Cigarette boats are still there, sleek, fast, gleaming, but they no longer feel like invitations. They feel like artifacts. You think about the Dadeland Mall shooting again. The checkpoint. The warehouse arguments. The business card sitting heavy in your drawer. You think about how close you were. Not to legend. Not to power, but to collapse. A lesser-known truth about addiction. Survival often looks ordinary. It doesn't involve dramatic speeches or cinematic exits. It involves saying no repeatedly. It involves boredom. It involves choosing sleep over spectacle. One night, a former contact calls unexpectedly. You let it ring. He leaves no message. You delete the number. The skyline glows outside your balcony as it always has. But it no longer feels like it's watching you. It's just there. And you're just here. Not chasing the brightest light. Not balancing on a wire. Not bracing for impact. Just living in a city that once nearly consumed you, and realizing that sometimes the most radical act in a place built on excess is restraint. Restraint becomes a habit the same way indulgence once did, quietly. Through repetition. You wake before sunrise now. Not because your heart jolts you awake, but because your body has relearned a rhythm that isn't powered by chemistry. The air is still humid, but the mornings feel cooler, gentler. You lace up your shoes and step outside while most of the city is still half asleep. Running along the water, you pass fishermen setting up lines, janitors hosing down sidewalks, early commuters sipping coffee at bus stops. Miami in these hours feels almost innocent. You realize you never saw this version of the city when you were chasing neon. News still carries echoes of the cocaine era, sentencing reforms, cartel violence abroad, crack's ongoing impact in American neighborhoods, but the headlines no longer feel personal. They feel historical. Historians continue debating the long-term consequences of the war on drugs policies that intensified in the early 1980s. Some argue they reshaped law enforcement permanently. Others contend they created unintended social costs that would echo for decades. Miami became a case study, a symbol, a lesson. You were never the symbol. You were the footnote. And footnotes rarely survive storms. A lesser-known psychological shift in sustained recovery is something called cue extinction over time. The triggers that once sparked craving lose intensity if they're not reinforced. You notice it when you drive past a club and feel nothing more than mild nostalgia. The bass thumps faintly through the walls. But your pulse doesn't leap. It's not indifference. It's distance. You've started volunteering on weekends, nothing dramatic. Just helping at a community center. You don't announce your past. You don't perform redemption. You just show up. One afternoon, a teenager asks you why Miami used to be so crazy. You pause before answering. People made fast choices. You say carefully. It feels like enough. Your chest hasn't fluttered in weeks now. The medication, the sleep, the absence of powder, it's all working together. The heart that once pounded like an engine strapped to your ribs now beats steadily. Predictably. You still carry faint reminders. A slight whistle in your breathing when you inhale deeply. Occasional waves of anxiety when helicopters pass overhead. The nervous system doesn't erase history, it archives it. But the archive no longer runs the present. Miami's skyline continues to rise. New glass towers reflect sunlight where warehouses once stood. Tourists pose for photos, unaware of the layers beneath their feet. Historians will continue parsing this era, debating how deeply cocaine money infiltrated institutions. How enforcement evolved. How media narratives shaped memory. You've stopped debating. You sit on your balcony one evening, watching boats move across calm water. They're recreational now, families, couples, laughter drifting faintly through humid air. You remember when boats meant speed and risk and midnight transfers. Now they just mean motion. You close your eyes and breathe in slowly. The city hums, not urgently, just steadily. You think about the wire you once balanced on. How thin it was. How certain you felt while walking it. It amazes you now how confidence can mask fragility. But fragility, you've learned, can be strengthened, not through spectacle, through repetition, through small, boring, deliberate choices. You stand up from the balcony railing and step inside. No silver trays, no coded calls, just a quiet apartment and the steady rhythm of your own breathing. Miami hasn't stopped glowing. You've just stopped mistaking the glow for safety. You've also stopped mistaking intensity for meaning. There was a time when every night felt like it mattered, like if you weren't inside the pulse of the city, you were falling behind it. Now, evenings unfold softly. Dinner, a phone call, a book left open on the coffee table. The silence no longer feels like a threat. Miami, meanwhile, keeps rewriting itself. By the mid-1980s, federal enforcement has significantly disrupted many of the original trafficking structures that once dominated South Florida. New routes emerge elsewhere. Distribution patterns shift. The spotlight moves. Historians still debate whether Miami's early cocaine era was uniquely explosive or simply the first visible chapter in a broader national story. But few dispute that the city became a template, both for rapid illicit wealth and for aggressive federal response. You watch a documentary one night about the period you lived through. It features archival footage, speedboats slicing across black water, news anchors with grave expressions, stacks of seized cocaine on folding tables. The narration sounds dramatic, sweeping. It leaves out the insomnia. It leaves out the bathroom mirrors. It leaves out the way your chest used to flutter in the quiet after the music stopped. You turn off the television before the credits roll. A lesser-known reality about recovery is the quiet grief that sometimes surfaces, not for the drug itself, but for the version of yourself who believed in the illusion. You grieve the naivete, the certainty, the reckless confidence that once felt like destiny. But you don't romanticize it anymore. You meet your sister at the airport one weekend. She steps into the humid Miami air and laughs at the heat. You help her with her suitcase, noticing how light it feels compared to the invisible weight you used to carry. Over dinner, she talks about ordinary things, work, neighbors, small frustrations. You listen fully, not half distracted by coded messages or delivery windows. A lesser-known psychological benefit of sobriety from stimulants is the return of sustained attention. Conversations deepen, time stretches, moments feel anchored instead of accelerated. You hadn't realized how fragmented your attention had become until it returned. Later that night, you walk her back to her hotel along Ocean Drive. Neon still flickers. Music still pulses behind closed doors. Tourists chase the myth of Miami under pink and blue lights. You feel no pull, just awareness. Historians will keep debating whether the war on drugs policies that intensified in this era solved more than they complicated. They'll examine sentencing disparities, economic shifts, law enforcement strategies. They'll parse data and argue over outcomes. You don't argue anymore. You've simplified your metric. Are you breathing steadily? Are you sleeping? Are you present? The answers are mostly yes. You pass by a bank branch where you once structured careful deposits under reporting thresholds. The building looks ordinary now. Fluorescent lights, tellers counting bills. It feels almost absurd that so much tension once pulsed beneath that simplicity. A lesser-known institutional shift from those years. Financial compliance systems grew more sophisticated. Transaction monitoring more rigorous. Reporting more automated. The era forced modernization. You smile faintly at the thought that even systems learned from the chaos. At home, you stand on your balcony again. The skyline hums softly in the distance. You place your hand lightly over your chest, not out of fear, but habit. Your heartbeat is steady, predictable. There was a time when you thought survival meant outrunning consequences. Now you understand it means slowing down enough to let your body recover from them. Miami glows as it always has. But tonight, it's not a spotlight. It's just a city at dusk. Dusk feels different when you're not chasing the night. You sit by the water as the sky fades from gold to violet. Watching the city transition without urgency. The same skyline that once felt like a scoreboard, counting money, risk, status, now feels architectural. Steel and glass holding the last light of day. Miami survived its own excess. Not cleanly, not without scars, but it survived. By the late 1980s, many of the original cocaine networks that dominated South Florida had fractured or shifted. Federal prosecutions, internal conflicts, international pressure, together they altered the landscape. New trafficking routes emerged elsewhere. The spotlight moved. Historians still debate whether Miami's cocaine era permanently embedded certain cultural myths, fast money, glamour, danger, or whether it became a cautionary chapter layered beneath a city that continued evolving. Both can be true at once. You think about how myth works. It erases the boredom, the waiting, the quiet fear between phone calls. It doesn't show the ceiling fan spinning at 3:17 a.m. It doesn't show the bathroom mirror reflecting a face too wired to sleep. A lesser-known truth about high-risk eras: most of the damage isn't cinematic. It's cumulative. Elevated blood pressure, eroded trust, nights without rest. You carry faint remnants of that accumulation. A subtle whistle in your breathing. Occasional tension when sirens echo through humid air. But they're echoes now, not commands. You've started mentoring someone at the community center. A teenager with too much curiosity and not enough boundaries. He talks about wanting to make it big, fast, visible. You listen carefully before answering. Big doesn't always mean stable. You tell him. He rolls his eyes lightly. Youth has its own chemistry. You recognize it. You don't preach. You just show up again the next week. Consistency feels more radical than spectacle ever did. One evening, you attend a small neighborhood event, music, food, families gathered under string lights. The atmosphere is simple, no velvet ropes, no coded conversations, just neighbors laughing. You realize something quietly profound. You once mistook exclusivity for value. Now, accessibility feels richer. Historians will continue dissecting the war on drugs policies born from this era, arguing about enforcement intensity, sentencing disparities, community impact. Miami remains a case study in both economic acceleration and social cost. But your case study is internal. You measure progress in heartbeats instead of headlines. You drive past the marina again. Slower this time. Boats still line the docks. Engines gleaming. You no longer associate them with midnight transfers. They're recreational now. Families loading coolers. Couples laughing. The same water, different meaning. A lesser-known phenomenon in recovery is memory recontextualization, the ability to revisit past experiences without craving their repetition. You can look at neon lights without feeling pulled toward them. You can hear bass without scanning for mirrors. The city hasn't softened. You have. At home, you open a window and let the humid air drift inside. The ceiling fan hums. But it no longer masks anxiety. It's just sound. You think about the wire you once balanced on, the arrogance you carried, the near misses you didn't fully understand at the time. You survived, not because you were smarter than everyone else, but because you eventually chose smaller steps, smaller deposits, smaller circles, smaller nights. Until the wire ended and solid ground appeared beneath your feet. Miami's lights flicker in the distance. They don't feel like temptation anymore. They feel like history. History feels quieter than memory. Memory is loud. It plays scenes on loop. The first line in a mirrored bathroom. The speedboat engine ripping through black water. The Dadeland Mall chaos. The checkpoint flashlight grazing your face. History, though, settles. It arranges events into chapters instead of pulses. You're walking along the bay at twilight. Hands in your pockets. Humidity soft against your skin. The skyline reflects in the water like a painting that's finally dry. Miami is no longer the epicenter of your nervous system. It's simply where you live. By the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, the most explosive chapter of the city's cocaine boom has passed. Enforcement structures are more coordinated. Financial oversight is more sophisticated. Trafficking routes have diversified geographically. The mythology remains, but the intensity that once defined daily life has dulled into documentation. Historians still debate the long-term socio-economic consequences of that era, how neighborhoods were reshaped, how incarceration patterns shifted, how financial institutions adapted. The arguments are complex, layered. You think about complexity often now. Back then, everything felt binary, risk or reward, expansion or stagnation, high or crash. Now, life feels textured, gradual. A lesser-known truth about recovery from stimulant dependency is that emotional range expands slowly. Subtle feelings return first: contentment, mild disappointment, quiet pride. They're not fireworks, they're embers. You've come to prefer embers. One afternoon, you visit Dadeland Mall again. It's renovated, bustling, ordinary. Shoppers carry bags. Children tug at parents' hands. The air conditioning hums politely. You stand in the corridor where gunfire once shattered glass. There's no plaque marking the moment. No visible scar. History doesn't always leave physical reminders. But you remember. Not with panic, not with shame, just awareness. You realize how fragile normalcy once felt, and how fiercely it persists anyway. Later that evening, you sort through old papers at home. Bank statements from years ago. Receipts. A folded business card without a name. You hold it for a long moment before tearing it in half. It's symbolic, yes, but also practical. You no longer need relics to remind you of who you were. Miami outside hums steadily. Boats move across dark water. Music drifts faintly from somewhere down the block. The city is alive, as it always has been. But it's no longer racing you. Your heart beats evenly in your chest. Predictable, measured. You think about the young version of yourself stepping onto that humid sidewalk in 1977, curious, ambitious, convinced you could outrun consequences with enough confidence. You don't judge him. You just feel grateful you outlived him. The wire is long behind you now. The undertow distant. The machinery humming somewhere else. What remains is quieter. Breath in. Breath out. A city that survived its own fever. And you, no longer electrified by neon, standing calmly in its glow. You stand calmly in its glow long enough to realize something almost strange. Miami never needed you to burn with it. It keeps moving. It keeps rebuilding. It keeps layering new stories over old foundations. You sit on your balcony one last time tonight. The humid air softer than it once felt. The skyline stretches across the horizon. No longer a scoreboard. No longer a spotlight. Just light against dark water. Boats drift quietly. Traffic murmurs below. Somewhere, music hums faintly, but it doesn't pull at you anymore. There was a time when this city felt like voltage, every street corner buzzing, every night demanding participation. Cocaine sharpened that voltage until it felt like destiny. You mistook acceleration for progress. You mistook proximity to danger for importance. Historians will keep debating the legacy of those years, how the cocaine boom reshaped Miami's economy, how federal enforcement recalibrated financial systems, how crack markets scarred communities, how media mythologized it all into something glossy and exaggerated. They'll argue about policy effectiveness, about unintended consequences, about whether the war on drugs solved more than it complicated. But from where you're sitting now, the legacy feels smaller. It's measured in heartbeats. Your heart, once racing through sleepless nights, once stuttering under chemical strain, beats steadily now. Not dramatic, not heroic, just steady. You think back to the mall floor under fluorescent lights, the speedboat engines slicing through moonlit water, the warehouse doors clanging shut, the checkpoint flashlight catching your eyes, the bathroom mirrors reflecting a version of you who believed he was invincible. That version wasn't evil, just restless, hungry for intensity. A lesser-known truth about survival is that it rarely feels triumphant. It feels ordinary. It feels like waking up without dread. Like paying rent with money that doesn't buzz in your pocket. Like sleeping through the night without replaying sirens in your mind. You've rebuilt slowly, not dramatically. No grand confessions. No public reckonings. Just consistency. Doctor visits. Morning runs. Dinners you don't cancel. Miami continues glowing behind you. Still beautiful. Still complicated. Still layered with history most visitors never see. And you no longer feel the need to keep pace with it. The ceiling fan hums softly inside your apartment. The night air brushes your face. You close your eyes and breathe in slowly. The city isn't vibrating anymore. Or maybe it is. But you're no longer tuned to its most frantic frequency. You're tuned to something steadier, your own pulse, your own breath. There's a kind of mercy in that. The neon years will live on in documentaries and debates and cinematic retellings. Historians will continue arguing over data and policy and myth. But your story isn't about legend. It's about survival in small increments. And survival, you've learned, is quieter than spectacle. Now the lights across the water soften. The boats become silhouettes. The hum of traffic blends into something almost like ocean wind. Your breathing slows. The past drifts backward, speedboats fading into distance. Mirrors dimming. Helicopters dissolving into the night sky. What remains is gentle. A steady heartbeat. A quiet room. A city at rest. Let the skyline blur. Let the memories loosen their edges. Let the ceiling fan's soft rhythm carry you somewhere lighter than neon and faster than fear. You are no longer balancing. No longer bracing. No longer running. Just breathing. And that is enough. End of script. Sweet dreams.